everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Tensura Reborn as the first Nephilim, Chapter 21-30, Chapter 20 Lucian had used spatial motion to take them to a village near the border of Dworgen and Falmouth that he and Blake had passed through before. That alone would shorten their trip some by putting them closer to Ingracia. It also got them far away from the Connaught Mountains and near a place with a nice inn for them to rest at. The village may have been small and without a proper name, but it was homey and fairly safe. So after making a short trek to the village itself and renting a room at the previously mentioned inn, the group of 5 rested until sunrise the next day. After everyone was awake once more, and Lucian and Shizu made sure they had all the supplies they would need, the party of adventurers left to make their way west. The journey itself was fun, late-night campfire gatherings and jovial travel games paired with the occasional monster or bandit attack. The whole group had found it quite odd though when Lucian got excited after finding a green slime monster, and insisted he be the one to fight it. However, they soon understood when he explained the 2 main skills that slime had given him after slaying it: absorption and dissolve. Those 2 skills would pair with any analysis skill to absurd levels, but when paired with the powers of degenerate and material creation, some absurd things suddenly became possible. Direct and more in-depth study of substances for one, an easier time combining and altering materials for another. Alfred and Blake only understood that it was something useful, and were happy for him, but Shizu and Alice had a different reaction. Shizu, being the original owner of Degenerate, understood what those skills could do. The main limitations of the unique skill was that it struggled on affecting things outside the user, hence why it was best used on skills and the like. But with the ability to absorb material, thus making it technically a part of the user, it made it far easier to affect things like metals and plants. Alice on the other hand saw it as an incredible research aid, and immediately asked for a copy. The ability to study physical magical phenomena more in-depth would pair well with her own unique skill after all. Lucian agreed and had Puriel make a copy of the skill for his spawn. After that they went on with the travels, Alice muttering about possible uses of her new skill all the while. The rest of them smile at her antics, having gotten used to the black-haired demon's fascination with research. Lucian was glad though that she wasn't like other mad researcher types. She knew her limits, and had a solid foundation for ethical research. In short, she may be mad but she wasn't evil. He was glad for that. The last thing he wanted was an Orochimaru situation. Later that night, while Lucian was keeping watch for his sleeping companions, he decided to try out using his absorption. He took out some dragon bone from his storage space and placed it before him. Once he deemed the volume of bone sufficient, the Nephilim used the skill on the bones. After fully absorbing the dragon bone, he spoke to Puriel at his request. Puriel, can you use the absorbed dragon bone and mix it with my magisteel body? See about upgrading my vessel to Dracosteel like Graham, he asked, his ultimate skill. Request confirmed. Using analytical appraisal on newly absorbed dragon bones and the sword known as Graham. Successful. Integrating dragon bone into vessel's structure to enhance magisteel skeleton into Dracosteel commencing. This process will take 1 month to complete. In order to do so safely, and without risking destabilizing vessel integrity, Puriel told him, as it ran calculations on how best to accomplish what its user sought to do. A month isn't that bad, all told. I just know that I can't wait the possible years it would take for my vessel to evolve on its own. Plus, this will hopefully lead to more synergy with complete draconic core and Graham, Lucian thought to himself before resuming his watch. Time passed and soon enough they had been traveling for close to 2 weeks. Now getting near Blumen's border with the kingdom of Falmouth and skirting the edge of the forest of Jura, when they heard a commotion. The sounds of battle were clearly heard by all of them, metal slashing and magic landing being very familiar sounds to them all. Deciding to head in that direction in case someone needed help, they soon came to the site where the sound originated. A party of 7 adventurers, 5 frontliners and 2 mages, were all fighting against what looked to be a large ogre. He had gray skin with glowing red veins, shaggy brown hair, and stood about 8 feet tall. He wasn't something you saw every day, and what he said made that more so. "I don't want to fight." I'll go. The oddly young-sounding ogre shouted to them. The adventurers simply laughed in mockery of the mun. They made comments about how much they might get from the guild for killing such an interesting monster. About how they had never met such an ogre like this one. It seemed that the ogre in question was not the aggressor in this instance, but was trying to defend himself as best he could. However, it was obvious to all 5 of Lucian's group that he wasn't going to last long. A combination of a clear lack of training and no armor made it clear he would be the loser in this fight. Had already decided to try and step in to resolve this peacefully, when one of the group said something that unknowingly signed their death warrant. "Hey, with how much we're beating on this guy, maybe we should take it alive. I bet a unique monster like this would net us far more in the markets than the guild would pay us," the mages said to the group. The evident leader of the party, a bald man in well-made leathers and wielding a sword, responded in affirmation to his party members' words. "Ha ha, yeah. I think that could get us all a nice little payday, huh boys," he shouted out, seemingly ready to lead them into a charge to capture the now even more frightened ogre. The party of adventurers never made it though, instead being engulfed in blue flames so hot they turned to ashes before they could even feel the pain. Lucian had become livid at those words, the memory of what happened to Blake not having faded in the least. That combined with his own revulsion for slavery made him act far harsher than he might have otherwise. So, with a burst of flames from Essence of Flames, all of them were incinerated to naught, but slavers, Lucian growled out and spit on the ground, "Makes me sick." He got nods from the rest of his group with those words. Shizu and Blake detested such people for obvious reasons, and the 2 demons had been told what had almost become of their uncle. To say there was none that took issue with their leader's actions was an understatement. But that didn't matter right now. What mattered was healing up the big guys. "Hey big guy, you're good now," Lucian spoke up to the ogre while walking closer slowly. The large ogre looked wary at first before easing. He was smart enough to know that with how easily the silver-haired man killed his attackers, that if he wanted him dead then he'd be sure. He had some resistance to fire, but he doubted it was enough to survive such. In the end he nodded and sat down so as to be closer to eye level with the one who saved him. From his own experience, most people were calmer when he did so, less intimidated and wary of him. "I thank you for your aid," he said, a rough voice coming out surprisingly softly and low. Lucian smiled at the man in response. "It was no trouble at all. I can't stand people like that anyway, those willing to sell another like that," the Nephilim told him, getting a grunt of acknowledgement from the larger man. Lucian came closer then and reached out his hand that glowed a soft, soothing light. "Would it be okay if I healed you up? You got quite a few nasty marks on you from those idiots," he asked, trying his best to be gentle and non-threatening while his friends watched on ready to intervene. The giant ogre looked pensive for a moment, like he was trying to see if this was a trick. After a moment of thought though, and feeling no ill intent in either the mun or his magic, he nodded his agreement. Lucian then put his glowing hand on the ogre's knee, and slowly the cuts and scrapes he'd gained healed. Soon he felt better than he had in weeks, his muscles relaxing and his fatigue draining from him, as the mun worked his magic. In a few moments it was done, and he was fully healed. It was a novel sensation for him, having never experienced healing magic of any kind before. Now he understood why those in the village had spoken of it with such reverence and respect despite them being a warrior people. Such magic was incredible, and to think it was so freely offered made him tear up slightly. Not many had treated him with kindness in his life, the party of now dead adventurers being but the latest to inflict their cruelty. Lucian saw that the ogre was getting emotional and decided to speak up. He figured that he wouldn't wish to cry in front of those he just met after all. "So can you tell us what happened here?" he asked gently with a calm tone of voice. The ogre took the gesture for what it was as he calmed himself before speaking. The others in Lucian's group came closer then as well and soon started setting up camp as he spoke. told them how he had recently lost his mother and been forced from his village. Wandered unsure of what to do with life and wishing to find a place to belong. Remembered several in his village mentioned being mercenaries for others in the outside world, and about how they could make a name for themselves by doing so. He hadn't known where to go for that though, and hoped that those in a nearby settlement would help him. So far, he'd been chased out of every settlement he came across, his large size scaring most who saw him. A few times he'd even been chased by the city guard with arrows and swords. This mix of running and a lack of a map resulted in him getting closer and closer to human territory, and closer to adventure routes by chance, thus leading to him trying to find a road to follow and running afoul of those adventures. They'd chased him from the road but didn't stop there, determined to kill him or, as he later learned, enslave him. Now he had no idea where he was, having run blindly and focused on surviving the attacks against him. He knew he was strong and possibly could have killed his attackers, had he known how to use it. It was as the others had deduced, he had no training in how to fight, and his size made him slow. No one in his village had been willing to teach him or spar with him, afraid of him as they were. All he really knew how to do was run, block, and look scary. Lucian and the rest knew that wasn't enough to deter people like those adventurers, likely having been around B2A rank from the look of their gear. For them, he was nothing more than a big target and an even bigger payday. It was a shame that such people often got away with doing such things, protections for monsters nearly non-existent in the West. Jerks would have more than gotten away with it. It was to the point that in the West a pet or familiar had more rights than a peaceful monster minding their own business like the big guy. After he told them all his story, the setting up of the camp was finished and dinner, was a large pot, was placed over the fire, and a stew with dragon meat and vegetables was as they all waited for the stew to cook. The group of adventurers told the large ogre about their travels, of fighting bandits and dragons, of how only 2 of their members were, of how Lucian met Blake, and later how the 2 meet Shizu. It was a good night, eating a hearty meal once the stew was finished and sharing both food and story with Anu. The large man enjoyed his meal with great enthusiasm, having grown up on a basic fare his whole life and never tasting something as delicious as dragon meat before. It was tender, and the stew itself was warming in a comforting way he hadn't felt in some time. The company that went with it made it all the better for him. Seeing these people joke and laugh, accepting him in their circle so easily, it made him happier than he'd been in months. This had been what he was looking for. This feeling, this sense of belonging and acceptance. None there feared him or looked at him as if he were a stain to be cleansed. No one stared at him like he was a freak, as if he was lesser. Only one other person had treated him like that, and she was now gone. His mother had been the best he could have asked for, but it had still been so lonely in his village. For once, now here with these people, he didn't feel lonely. Didn't feel like an outsider, as if he was other. They saw him as just another person, and maybe a friend to be made. This belief was cemented even further once the stew was finished, and all had sated there. The group of friends started to pitch tents that Lucian removed from his spatial storage, and he had moved to walk away. It was just a foregone conclusion to him that these people, no matter how nice, would not let him share in their encampment that night. The silver-haired man walked up to him and asked his question. He was surprised immensely. "Where would you like your tent set up?" he asked the giant of a man, voice earnest and lacking any hint of deception. The stone-skinned man was shocked and wasn't sure what he meant. "But I don't have one," he said, almost as if asking a question instead of stating the reality as. He knew it to be due to his surprise. Lucian chuckled at that and, right before his eyes, made a tent using material creation that was enlarged to fit his great size. "Well, now you do," the Nephilim said with a smile on his face. In somewhat numb movements the ogre pointed to a spot that was clear when asked again where he'd like his tent. In short order he now had a fully set-up tent with blankets and pillows, not needing the former but appreciating it all the same. None had done such kindness for him in his travels. None had so willingly come to his aid, had given him such things as food and shelter so readily. How can I repay your kindness? He asked before everyone went to their tents for the night. They all looked at him as if puzzled by his question. As if asking what is there to repay. With naught but their eyes. It was then that each of them told him there was nothing to repay, they merely were doing what was right. That to them, such kindness for one in trouble was only logical to do when it cost them nothing. To them, it was basic courtesy and nothing, but for him it was far more than that. Far more indeed. It was with thoughts of how these people had treated him, of how he felt content for the first time in months, that he came to a decision. He was an ogre, even if only half. And ogres were known to swear themselves to those they found worthy, such as demon lords. What he'd seen, and the stories told, Lucian was definitely worthy. So he resolved himself to ask the man in the morning an important question. Would he be willing to take on one such as him as a subordinate? Lucian was surprised at what he was being told. It was still nighttime, and he'd grown curious as to what race the large man was. He could tell from the obvious ogre features as well as from the man's story that he was some type of ogre or related species. What he hadn't expected was the answer Puriel gave him after asking the ultimate skill to do an analysis. Really quick. From what his skill was telling him, it seemed that this man was like him in a way, a half-breed. However, it seemed this one had come about more naturally than his own existence. What was the other half of the man's lineage? Well, it was quite simple really. He was half. This led to him having far greater strength than an ogre should, and his race was in fact referred to as a giant ogre. It was also from his heritage that something interesting arose. The man had an intense affinity for both the fire and earth elements. Furthermore, from what Puriel was able to tell, it seemed those elements were trying to merge together but had so far been unsuccessful. In all, this man was not something one came across every day. To be honest, Lucian was considering asking the guy to become his subordinate in the morning. However, that may be too rash, even for him. So he resolved himself to wait in bringing it up. Maybe after they had traveled for long enough together the man would ask on his own. That would be helpful. With thoughts like those in the night, Lucian was certainly surprised that the next morning the giant ogre came up to him after breakfast with a request. "Let me be your follower, my lord," the grey-skinned man said whilst kneeling on the ground, Lucian and the others looking at the man in surprise. Well, I guess that works too, Lucian thought with a flummoxed expression on his face. Edited, January 27, 2026. Chapter 22. Chapter 21. At first Lucian wasn't sure he heard the man right. How on earth could he have this kind of just when he had made the decision to see about recruiting him? The giant goes, and does it was honestly a good thing, just not what he'd expected in the least. Are you sure about this? I'm not going to say no, but I want to make sure this is really what you want, the Nephilim asked the kneeling man. I'm certain, my lord, he shouted, not raising his head yet before the one he wished to pledge his service to. Lucian looked to his companions then to gauge their thoughts on the matter. Noticing this, they all responded one by one with their own feelings about it. First was Alice and Alfred, who were standing next to one another with smirks on their faces. I'll follow your lead, sire, Alice said with a smile, with her brother giving a nod of agreement to her words. Next was Blake, who looked relaxed and unbothered in his adventurer gear. I'm cool with it. Plus, I might get to teach the big guy how to fight, and get a new sparring partner, the redhead said with a laugh at the end to puncture his words. Finally, Lucian looked towards Shizu. The swordswoman looked between Lucian and the men kneeled before for a bit before giving a smile of her own. I think he'd be a good addition to your group, Lucian. I say go for it, she told him while giving him a thumbs up. Lucian was glad none of his friends took issue with it. It made it all the easier to agree and make his decision. Turning to the large man, Lucian took in a deep breath before speaking and placed a hand on the man's shoulder. Very well then. From here on out you are my sworn subordinate. In recognition of this I shall give you the name Surtur, he proclaimed as a glow enveloped the man at his naming. As the glow intensified, Lucian smirked. Surtur had much potential, he could sense it. With a man like him on his side, his goals will be all the easier to achieve. Plus, the guy seemed like he could use a friend or two, and Lucian didn't have nearly enough of those to turn down as good of one as the man before him was likely to be. It was a few days later, and the now party of 6 were making good progress on their travels. If Lucian was correct in his assessment, then they were only a week's travel away from Ingracia, and another few days after that till they made it to the capital. To be honest, the Nephilim was a bit nervous about what would come next for their group once they went back down to 5. Shizu had become someone important to them all. Even Surtur, in the small time he'd been with them, enjoyed her company. It was going to be sad to see her go for them all. But on the topic of Surtur, he'd changed quite a bit from the evolution he underwent after gaining his name. Now, instead of being a giant ogre, he had evolved into a giant Kijin. Skin was no longer the stone gray with red veins, instead now being of a tanned complexion like he spent his whole life in the sun. His hair had become a burgundy color, seemingly merging the brown and red from before into the new color. His eyes were coal black with a faint red ring around them that was hard to spot unless you were close. Surtur had also gained a second horn, with his first moving over to one side of his head with the new one on the opposing side. The horns were still red like before though, even glowing slightly when he sparred with the others or when he was pumped up. What was more surprising was his height, more specifically his loss of height. In his evolution, Surtur had gained a new extra skill by the name of compress. Allowed him to shrink his size and aura to better fit in, leading to his current height of 6 feet, and an aura that made him appear like a normal man. It seemed to have been born from his desire to better fit in, sadly, but it did make it far easier to take him into towns and the like. Especially since after evolving his true height, when not compressed, had increased by 2. The fact that he could grow even larger on command honestly made the rest of the group a bit surprised. After all, seeing a 15-foot red-skinned man with horns like Surtur in his giant form would make anyone taken aback. It wasn't just his appearance and gaining compress that he got from his evolution though. Surtur had already possessed both flame manipulation and earth domination, and so after evolving they became the extra skill flame domination, as expected, and land manipulation, an advanced form of the earth element. He also possessed the extra skills giant strength that allowed him to empower himself and stone skin that increased his durability. Alongside those he had his intrinsic skills as well: mana jamming, flame attack resistance, thermal fluctuation resistance, and mana resistance. All that made Surtur one hell of a tank, and it showed when he went up against them, and in fact, the giant's defense was so strong that even with his new unique skill Alfred could barely phase the man. At least not within the short spars they had, that is. And when it came to magic, the man could take an even greater beating. It had made Alice almost use some of her more destructive spells before Lucian told her to stop. Surtur more than likely could have taken them, but the surroundings couldn't, that's for sure. Lucian almost had a heart attack when Shizu admitted to teaching the mad witch her explosive flame magic after that incident. The fact that he had heard her talk to herself about mixing explosion magic with other elements and magic types made him have cold sweat, and didn't help the matter. With words like explosive mist and liquid bomb, he started to think he maybe should have named her Megumin instead. Luckily, she did all her experiments with such magic within a barrier that he had made to keep whatever was happening within to only affect what was within. That barrier had been a pain to make from scratch, but it was so worth it. Now his mad mage could do her crazy experiments without destroying the countryside, and his boys could beat the crap out of each other while mitigating the damage the shockwaves caused. Regardless, it had been a good few days of traveling and getting to know Surtur more and more. They were stopping in a small town for supplies. Having another mouth to feed that happened to eat enough for 5 men made them feel it best to stock up before going any further. It was simple enough to get a bunch of food in bulk from a friendly merchant. Cost them a few silvers but nothing too extreme, probably helped that they were near the major farming center of the nation, so transport costs weren't too bad. It was one of the benefits of buying supplies in smaller towns and the like instead of in large cities. Plus, it helped that they weren't buying meat, and instead were getting staples like flour and vegetables. The party of 6 were fully capable of hunting for their own meat after all. Once their resupplying was done and over with, they spent the night in the town's inn for a modest fee. The next morning it was back to traveling though. "I'm going to miss this," Shizu thought to herself as they left the town for the main road. It had been some time since she'd enjoyed traveling this much. Hopefully she would get to do so again before her time came. The party of 6 had decided to take today off from traveling, only but a few days left until they made it to the capital now. Today they decided to focus on training instead. Blake was in a gravity-increasing barrier while swinging a sword to train his strength. The blade had been made with his skill to be made from an incredibly dense material, resulting in the normal-sized longsword weighing over 200 pounds. That weight was under normal gravity though, but under the barrier's increased gravity it weighed about 5 times as much. Yet he was swinging with only the strain expected from normal exercise, not the near-impossible effort it should have taken to do so. But he was no longer a normal man, not even a human in truth. No, he was an enlightened, something more than human. The teen didn't mean that in some arrogant way but in a quite literal sense. He didn't tire like a human, he didn't need to eat the same as a human. He didn't even need to sleep as much as a human, even taking his skill into account. What, for him at least, really made such a change apparent to him was how magic felt to him. Humans are naturally weak in terms of magical resistance, and Blake had been able to feel that since he could first understand the world around him. Due to living in a village that was often attacked by monsters, he had been around a high amount of magicals for his entire. In fact, his village was near the edge of the habitual range for magical density. Higher, and the village would need to have been moved unless they wanted people to drop like flies from the magic in the air. Now though Blake could be in far more densely magical-rich areas like the Connaught Mountains with not a single concern. Where before he could feel a kind of burn when entering the deep woods near the village from the intensity of the magicals, he could now enter far more densely saturated areas and feel right at home. As an enlightened he now could go with uncaring ease where a human would not dare venture. It was strange, an odd feeling that couldn't be quite put into words how he was now something more. The fact that he was now a different kind of life form even from what Lucian told him was only the cherry on top. Apparently normal humans are what is referred to as a demi-material life form. That meant that they were highly reliant on their physical bodies for things like thinking and existing in general. Now though as an enlightened he was a demi-spiritual, this meant he was no longer bound to his physical body like a human was. Thought more with his soul than his brain, his spirit more important than his flesh in terms of what he needed for survival. What were once fatal injuries was no more an inconvenience to be remedied. That had become apparent when he had taken an arrow to the head during a bandit ambush somehow, even with the arrow logged in his head he kept fighting. Once the battle was over he had thought he was going to die, it was a foregone conclusion to him. Can't heal from that, at least not without some great cost. Blake had been gearing up to say his goodbyes to his friends and loved ones when Lucian came over. His brother in all the ways that mattered simply used a spell to numb the area and pulled the arrow out. In a matter of moments the silver-haired man put a glowing hand to the wound and healed him right up. Blake had been stunned, no permanent damage or memory loss like he knew head wounds were wanted to cause. No, if anything he felt more annoyed with himself to be honest, and was fully capable of thinking like normal. That had been the moment he understood that he was no longer human. That night Shizu had come to him and talked to him about it. She was able to see the realization set in for him. How he no longer was what he once was, how he was more and yet. How he had become something he didn't think was possible, and what that meant she could relate to him in that sense, even if she was an incomplete demonic instead of an enlightened. She was like him, and she'd had her own moment of realization. Of understanding and questioning. Lucian didn't have such an experience of this gradual and almost unnoticed change in your very being. He'd been reborn as a fully spiritual life form, after living as a fully material one his whole life. His shift had been sudden and rapid, a forced form of adjustment that, while just as shattering to his worldview, was different than the gradual shift that the two of them had come to know. Shizu helped him come to terms with it, though, to understand that no matter what kind of body he lived in, he was still him. Blake was still the boy from a small nowhere village that had grown into the warrior he was now. It was thoughts like these that the teen felt creeping in from time to time, when he trained in ways that would rightly crush a normal man. If a year ago he'd attempted this, he would be dead or at the very least permanently injured. Now, though, he felt he was close to surpassing this workout, and would make it his warm-up within the month. Diligence was a major part of that, he knew, but it only sped things up, not made the impossible possible. The end, though, it was only a good thing that he was as he was now. If traveling with his brother had taught him anything, it was that this world was not one to simply let one live their life. No, slavers, monsters, wicked forces and any number of things will come and threaten what you hold. The only way to keep close what makes life worth living is to be strong enough to protect it when the world comes calling. Blake would make sure he would be strong enough when, not if, that day came once more. After all, he had a nephew and niece now, in addition to a new sparring partner to protect. He couldn't let them be taken away by the tides of the world like he'd almost been taken away from his brother. Lucian stood in front of Surtur inside of a barrier. They were to finally spar against one another properly. Blake was off swinging that far to heavy sword, Shizu was playing ref, and his spawn were beating the crap out of each other in a barrier next to the one he was in. Apparently, Alfred had said something about knights being stronger than wizards, and Alice took that personally. Now they were fighting to prove the other wrong, honestly kind of like normal siblings. Just far more explosions than normal. Regardless, the Nephilim had decided to see what the giant before him was capable of with his own two hands. For the fight he'd stored Graham and agreed to not use any weapons, Surtur not being bound by such restrictions. The large man had a gigantic blade in hand, courtesy of Blake, that was longer than most men were tall. It was a simple blade, but it did its job well. The both of them wore sparring clothes that he'd made with material creation that they wouldn't care about if they got destroyed. His were gray in color while Surtur's were red as per request. Now, they just had to wait for Shizu to give the signal. Thus, with a chopping motion, the spar began. Surtur blasted off from his position and aimed to cut Lucian in half with his great blade. Sadly, for the man, he wasn't nearly fast enough. Lucian was immediately behind him and gave a punch to his mid-back. The giant went flying and almost went to the edge of the. But he dug his hand into the ground and stopped his momentum just in time. The new distance between them, Surtur used his land manipulation skill to create jagged spikes of earth emerging from the ground and fired them at Lucian. The Nephilim deflected each and every one of them and closed the distance. The fight went on like this for a time, Surtur tanking a blow from Lucian, and then trying to retaliate with a bit of earth manipulation. The giant didn't dare use fire, knowing well his lord's affinity with it far outstripped his own. Soon, though, he grew desperate to at least land one blow, to do something to prove himself to his new lord. His desperation was apparently heard as he suddenly felt something shift within him. Earth felt different to his senses, still capable of being moved and formed as he wished it to, but now somehow more. Feeling heat build up inside him, he channeled it into the ground and felt the earth shift, change into something new. He glared at the ground that Lucian stood on and focused all this new power at that point. Suddenly the ground that he stared at began to deform before bursting out, a fountain of red magma gushing out from the earth to try and torch his opponent. Lucian was quite surprised and almost didn't dodge in time due to the suddenness. Resulted in him getting a burn for the first time in this world on his arm for his trouble. He was a good distance away from the lava, and the molten earth rapidly cooled. He looked at his newest companion with awe. That was incredible. I didn't know you could use lava, he shouted in excitement. The burn he had quickly healed as he said those words. Surtur rubbed the back of his head sheepishly at that. Ah, neither did I, my lord, he said, glad Lucian wasn't mad about the burn even with it being. Lucian called an end to the fight to the great agreement of Shizu. After changing into some new clothes, he made a new barrier for his giant friend to practice his new ability to get a better handle on it. It seemed to have come naturally to the man, so Lucian hoped that after some practice he might get a skill for the new ability. It was after doing that though that he asked Puriel a question. How did I get burned by that? I should be immune to things like that, he asked the ultimate. Notice, it is due to the fact that the attack in question was of the merged element lava that is a fusion of both land and flame. This results in it not being affected by normal resistance skills that block only heat or flames. In order to resist it, you would need a skill to resist earth-based attacks as well. In essence, if you don't resist all parts of it, you don't resist it at all when it comes to elemental attacks, Puriel told him in response. Lucian put his hand on his chin at that and thought to himself. I guess that makes sense. In order to block a more complex element, I need a more complex set of resistances. I do wonder though if the presence of this new element might be influenced by my contradiction skill though, he thought in curiosity. That is highly probable, was his skill's simple answer. The silver-haired man smirked at that, excited for what else lay in wait for his new subordinate. If Degrol is the earthquake, then I'll make you the eruption, he said with a smirk as he watched Surtur train his new power. Edited, January 27, 2026. Chapter 23, Chapter 22. That morning the group of 6 finally made it to the outskirts of the capital of Ingracia. Before getting in line to enter the city itself, Surtur shrunk down to blend in with the humans, Alice casting a minor illusion to hide his horns, finishing off the disguise. Now all of them looked the part of a human adventuring group like any other. The wait in line wasn't overly long, thankfully, a separate entrance for adventurers allowing for quick travel and entrance thanks to half their group possessing ID cards from the guild. All it took was them saying the other 3 were with them and would be registering soon, and they were on their way. Shizu had asked to stop by the main guild hall to say hi to her old student, Yuki. The rest of the party easily agreed, and Lucian even asked to tag along. The black-haired swordswoman agreed, and they were off. The Nephilim instructed Blake to use this time to register their 3 newer members with the guild, and to make sure they didn't show too much during their tests. Lucian's exact words were, "Make sure there is still a city when I get back." Blake knew well enough what his brother meant by that. Everyone in their part was certainly strong enough to cause major damage to the city if left unchecked. Or if they got a little too excited and forgot they weren't in one of Lucian's barriers that would prevent collateral, that was honestly more likely and a far more pressing concern. From Alice's insane experimental magic to Surtur being able to summon forth the power of a volcano, potentially the possible damage was massive, and Blake was best suited to keeping any mishaps in. If for no other reason than none of the 3 wanted to get the disappointed look from him that he learned from Lucian. Once they made it the main headquarters of the Free Guild, the group split in 2. Lucian went to the clerk that was responsible for high-ranking adventures while the others went to the newbie registration area. As Shizu was showing the clerk her ID and explaining what she was there for, Lucian was thinking about the upcoming meeting. This is going to be interesting indeed. I have no idea what version of Yuki I'm going to encounter, the naive dreamer, or the cunning bastard that wishes for naught but devastation. Either way, I need to keep my guard up. I'm glad though that after a talk with Shizu, she agreed to keep the information about me and the others' races from him. Turns out she understood my reservations, he thought to himself while thinking back on that talk. The conversation had taken place about a week before. He had brought up to her how he didn't wish for the leader of the Free Guild to know of his status as a Nephilim or the non-human nature of the others. When asked why, he was able to give an honest answer to her. I don't trust the man in charge of the largest monster-killing organization to not see me and my family as a threat, was his answer, which was true, but for reasons far beyond what Shizu had agreed after that, and even asked if he wished for her to keep it from Hinata as well. When Lucian had said it was fine if her favored student knew, she had been surprised. Though telling didn't refute the accusation of favoritism. When asked why he was okay with a literal holy knight knowing such things, Lucian had smiled. He told her that he knew something about the church that she didn't yet, Something she'll likely find out after she gets. He imagined that the true head of the church wouldn't have a major problem with him. Shizu was curious what that meant but accepted it wasn't something he was going to tell her. Not yet anyway. She had noticed some time ago that he seemed to know things that he shouldn't and knew aspects of this world that someone couldn't know. The fact that he wasn't surprised at the existence of ultimate skills was the major one for her. Ultimate skills were not something that many in this world knew of, herself only knowing of such things from her master and mumbles of Leon she overheard when serving him. But how he knew such things wasn't more than a curiosity to her. She knew he was a good person and would tell her eventually. It just seemed he was almost afraid, like how was when telling Blake about his reincarnation. Regardless, she understood his sense of caution in relation to Yuki. While the church had the veneer of it being a morally based form of protection, adventures were known more so for monsters slaying out of greed. The group that they had found attacking Surtur was but one of many such groups, and trusting the leader of such an institution was not an easy task. Back to the present, Lucian saw that the clerk motioned for Shizu to follow her. Along he began to walk through the large building, going up a few flights of stairs as they were led to Yuki's office. If he is dangerous though, I need some plans just in case. Right now, the one best suited to fighting him would be Blake, with his mystic arts being able to get through anti-skill. For now, I need to simply get his measure before making a move, Lucian thought to himself as they made it to the guildmaster's door. The clerk entered first and seemed to inform the man himself about his visitor. After doing so, she held the door open for them both, and he and Shizu entered the well-furnished room. Yuki sat at his large desk with a smile plastered on his face. Maybe it was Lucian's own wariness, but it looked fake to him, like a politician smiling for a photo with those they just Shizu. It's a pleasure as always to see you. And who is your new friend here? Deceptively young-looking man said as he motioned for them to take a seat. They sat down on one of the plush sofas in front of the man's desk, and the only woman in the room spoke up after getting comfortable. It's nice to see you too, Yuki. This is Lucian, a friend I've been traveling with for a little while now, she said back and introduced him along with her greeting. Yuki sat up straight from his previously more relaxed pose, putting his elbows onto his desk with hands folded. The otherworlder looked at Lucian intently for a bit, studying him for a moment before laughing. He held his hand out for a shake to the silver-haired man. Well, any friend of Shizu-sensei is a friend of mine. Nice to meet you, Lucian, he said, a smile plastered on like a mask. Lucian took a moment to respond but took the man's hand. As he did so, he activated thought acceleration to have longer to think while shaking the man's hand. Puriel, scan him as best you can. I want to see what you can find, he told his companion. Notice, scanning the soul of the individual known as Yuki Kagrazaka. Scanning of this individual has been somewhat impeded by the anti-skill constitution this individual has. In order to gain greater information, the abandonment of keeping this skin secret would be needed, Puriel told him after a moment. Lucian sped his thoughts back up and ended the handshake with the dangerous man in front. It's nice to meet you as well, Guildmaster. I've heard much about you, he said with an easygoing smile that was as fake as the man's own. Once back in his seat, Lucian sped his thoughts back up to converse with his skill once more. All right, what did you find out? It was a good call to keep things hidden over finding out more regardless of what you got, but I hope you got something through that protection of his, he asked his skill while also assuring them he would be happy with anything they got. The information gained is thus: Yuki Kagrazaka has a soul whose age is nearing its 4th decade, is in possession of an unknown unique skill, and is playing host to a second far older soul. Current estimations put him at a level of power equivalent to at least a demon lord seed, and nearing the limit of what his current race is capable of, Puriel told him, a hint of frustration seeming to be in their voice at how little they were able to find out. Lucian though wasn't bothered by the lack of more information. Just having the true age of the man was good enough, while the confirmation of what he already knew was only a plus, and by knowing Yuki's true age it made it easier to tell which version of Yuki he was dealing with. Ironically, him being older than he told everyone was a good thing. It meant he was likely his manga/anime self instead of his web novel self. That meant that he could potentially be reasoned with in the future, even though he was still a threat for now. But an ambitious and naive man wanting a world of true equality was far more preferable to the genocidal maniac that his light novel version was. Lucian wouldn't put his guard down still, but it made the need to kill this man go from high priority to be determined, which was something of a relief. After all, killing a man like this wouldn't be easy. He'd still do it if it proved necessary, but he hoped that wouldn't come to pass. Returning to normal time, Lucian gave his thanks to Puriel, and waited for the conversation to Shizu and Yuki spent a little while catching up with each other, Shizu speaking about the movement of monsters and Yuki about his efforts to start the Freedom Academy. Soon enough though, the topic came to why they were there. So, not that I don't appreciate seeing you teach, but what brings you? You're not one to stop by for a random chat, Yuki asked with a chuckle. Shizu rubbed the back of her head in embarrassment at that before she responded. Well, actually, I'm just stopping by while I'm here. I plan to take the warp portal to go visit Hinata, and I wanted to see you before heading off, she admitted, and got a surprised look from the guild master. Yuki was quiet for a little bit before speaking up again. Well then, I'll put in a word at the church and see about getting you moved up the list. Sure, you know anyone not a part of the clergy, or holy knights must wait for a while. Normally and last, I checked the current wait is 2 weeks. But with a word from the guild master, I'm sure I can get you a sooner appointment, Yuki said with a smile that actually reached his eyes this time. Both Lucian and Shizu were surprised. Not at the long wait they were to face normally, that had been expected. No, the fact that Yuki was willing to use some of his political weight to help her out was what made them surprised. After all, even with Shizu being his teacher, that wasn't something someone just did for someone. Even nobles would be hesitant to shift their weight like that. Oh, don't look so surprised. If my teacher wants to go visit her old student, it's only my prerogative to help. Plus, the church owes me a few favors after sending adventurers to help out some of their knights, and letting them use guild facilities at a discount compared to non-guild people. This is as good a use as any for them, he said with a shrug like it was no big. Lucian thought about that. This might actually not be that big a deal for someone like Yuki. Not only was he a political mastermind that was likely owed quite a few favors, but he was also arguably one of the most influential people in the West. Technically he only answered to the Council of the West, and even then, most wouldn't say he was fully powerless in front of he in a way controlled one of the largest military and logistic forces in the world, and that led to many doors opening. Moving up a friend on a list was something easy enough for him, especially with a close relationship with the church. Shizu smiled at her student, and went to thank him, when we heard a large explosion. Would already set them on alert, but the shout afterwards made Lucian shoot up from his seat, and head for the door. A loud voice that both Shizu and Lucian knew shouted out. It seemed Blake didn't have as smooth a time getting the others registered as hoped. Just hoped the damage wasn't too expensive. To say Blake wasn't having a good time was an understatement. Well, let's go back. After going up to the clerk in charge of registration, he'd been asked if he was willing to vouch for the others' skills so they could take a more accelerated test. He had agreed and told the truth about their abilities. All of them were at least B rank. He should have known that it wouldn't be so simple as to go directly to the normal B rank. No, instead the test for the accelerated trial was to spar against an A rank, and your level of success determined whether you passed or failed. In hindsight he should have called it off right when he'd been told that, but hindsight was 20/20. The A rank was a beefy man in full plate with a great sword in hand. He seemed to be a friendly enough guy, and so Blake had thought things would go well. First up was Surtur, and the fight was overall a good one. He'd told them all to hold back for these tests, and Surtur was doing well to follow those instructions. He'd made a large claymore for the giant to use in this test, and he held off the adventure well, but not too well. It became obvious to Blake though that Surtur was simply trying to wait out the clock. Thankfully, that was only the case to him, as he knew what Surtur could really do. After about 10 minutes the match was called and Surtur was officially a B rank adventure that was noted to focus on defense. While that wasn't wholly true, in actuality it was close enough that it would be easy enough to excuse any other ability the giant might show should they be put under scrutiny. After that, Alice was up. She focused on making distance between her and the proctor, standard mage tactics. She only showed off 2 elements of magic as well, fire and wind. Magic in order to not show more of her skill than necessary. After a few well-used higher-level spells from Alice, the armored man called it. Showing high proficiency with 2 different elements was already enough to prove her skill, the addition of good tactics was the cherry on top. Thus, in short order, she was given the honor of being recognized as a B rank magic user. Once it was Alfred's turn, things took a turn. He'd entered the arena and faced off against the man well enough. In the beginning, the white-haired man did a good job holding back, focusing on using his fists for now, not wanting to risk injuring his opponent with the use of his weapon. It even seemed like he was having fun even with the conditions set for him. Then, the good-natured smack talk went a little too far between him and the armored A rank. The whole fight the 2 warriors had been trading good-natured jabs at each other. Normal part of the fight, Alfred had gotten into the habit of smack-talking the bandits they fought, so it wasn't out of the norm for him. But once the proctor said his last insult things, "Hey, I bet that armor is a good mirror with how shiny it is. I guess with how little use it goes through, it needs all the help it can get to have an actual purpose," Alfred had said, making a crack at how unblemished the man's armor was. An insult that could be taken as friendly in the circumstances. "What, is that the best insult you've got? I guess you must have left the brains to your sister then. Come on, hit me already, or did no one ever teach you how to fight?" said with a laugh. Alfred grinned at the man before responding with a left hook and a rebuttal. "My sire taught me just fine," he shouted with pride in his voice. That seemed to be blood in the water for the armored man, a weak point he hoped to use to make his foe angry and unbalanced. "Well, your father must be one poor fighter then," he said, a laugh seeming to be in his throat before he noticed a change in the air. Alfred stood still in front of him, fist clenched tightly. Alfred tried to not let the insult enrage him as it did, but no one insulted his sire. His father. In a flash, the white-haired man had his fist planted in his foe's gut, the armor that was meant to protect him dented by the blow. Proctor went flying and Alfred heard Blake yell his name as the man flew into the far wall. Large boom was heard as the wall crumbled after being hit with a human projectile. Moment, Alfred stood there gathering his breath to calm himself. "No one, and I mean no one, insults my sire," he said, the rage in his eyes fading as he, after a short moment, Alfred turned around as his name was called, this time not by Blake. There in the hallway leading back into the main building was Lucian, Shizu, and someone he didn't know. Lucian had called out to him, and so now the demon was paying closer attention to his sire and his words. "Did you have to go so far? What am I going to do with you lot?" Lucian said, shoulders sagging as he sounded so utterly tired at what had happened. As Shizu gave him a stern look with a potion in hand, as she headed to the man he'd just put into a wall. Alfred rubbed the back of his head, and gave an apologetic look towards his sire. He said, knowing he'd just done something that could result in a problem, for he hoped it wasn't too bad though. Edited, January 27, 2026. Chapter 24. Chapter 23. Luckily for them, the proctor was right as rain after a healing potion, and had found the whole situation humorous. "I didn't know you had the frenzy skill, haha. Shows me to pick who to trash talk carefully," he'd said after Shizu healed him with a potion. It seemed that he was under the impression that Alfred had a frenzy skill that he couldn't control when angry, and that led to the situation at hand. The frenzy skill was known for doing that after all, so it wasn't too much of a logical leap to make. Lucian still decided he was going to give Alfred a scolding since he knew the white-haired man had been fully in control, no skill involved. After that, the trio of newbies got their guild membership, with Alfred being given the rank of B for his showing. Once that was taken care of, Shizu, Yuki and him went back to discuss the transport information. It boiled down to Yuki going to the local church, where the warp portal was, and having a conversation with the gut in charge. Shizu and Lucian would then come back the next day, and he'd let them know where to go from there. A simple matter and easy enough to do. When Shizu stood up and seemed to be ready to leave, Lucian stayed. "Come on, Lucian, we need to go find some lodging for the night," she said while turning to look at him. "Actually, I'd like to have a quick chat with the guild master first." "You go on ahead, it shouldn't be long," he told her in response. She looked between him and Yuki for a moment at that, unsure what to do. "It's fine, Teach, I'd like a small chat with your new friend as well," Yuki said with a smile on Shizu's side at that, and went for the door after telling Lucian she and the others shouldn't be far when he was done. Before leaving the room, Lucian heard her mutter something like "boys," with a thoroughly done voice. It seemed she thought they were about to do some form of macho intimidation thing, not something he was going to correct her on though. Once she had left the room, Yuki focused his attention on him with an intense look on his. Lucian was preparing for a lot of things to happen at that moment, but what left Yuki's mouth was not one of them. "What are you trying to do with my teacher?" he asked Lucian, dead serious voice and blank expression contrasting his earlier joviality. "What do you mean by that?" Lucian asked, mind going into overdrive trying to figure out what he was after. Yuki sighed and leaned back in his chair at that. He studied the Nephilim before him for a moment before answering. "Shizu is a nice woman, sometimes a little too nice. When she finds someone she thinks of as a friend or otherwise, she'll stand by them through thick and thin. Even if that person doesn't deserve it." At that last part, Lucian could swear he saw a look on the man's face that had a quality of self-loathing in it. Shaking his head, Yuki went on. "She trusts fiercely, and would take any betrayal harder than most. So what I'm asking is this, are you just using my teacher or are you genuine?" the young-looking man said at last, eyes scanning Lucian for any deceit. Lucian was a bit surprised, not having expected this from the guild master. It seemed this really was the manga version, and not the light novel version. The self-loathing he saw on his face was brief, only catchable with thought acceleration, but it was true. The concern that this whole situation smelled of also was too real to be faked. That made it all the easier to answer the man. "I just want to be her friend. She's helped me and my brother a lot these past few months, and I've come to care for her over that time. I wish her only the best," Lucian told him, the truth as easy to say as breathing. Yuki didn't relax immediately, seeming to analyze his words thoroughly before doing so. Once he was back to an at-ease position in his chair, his smile came back once again. "Good, that's what I like to hear. Now, what was it you wanted to talk about?" he asked in a more carefree manner than before. Lucian smiled back at the man and rubbed the back of his head before responding. "Well, you see, after the mess my companion made, I felt it best to offer some compensation. You see, I know quite a bit about demons, and I thought giving you some information about them would help you and the rest of the guild as repayment of a kind," Lucian told him, his offer genuine as he knew a lot of adventures died from the demon forces Guy was sending their way. Yuki had a bit of a surprised face at those words. "I won't say no to the information, but you don't need to just give it to me for free. Friend did is fully something we've prepared for, so it's not a big deal. I don't feel right just taking it though," he said, trailing off at the end of his sentence. Lucian saw an opportunity here, and decided to take it. "How about an exchange then? I give you the information on demons that I mentioned, and in exchange you agree to give me some information I want. Sound like a deal?" he asked with a false friendly smile on his face, still wary of the man for now. Yuki took a moment to consider it before he nodded at him. "Yeah, that sounds good. It's a deal then," he said with a smile on his face. Lucian smirked as he reached into his spatial storage, using material creation in conjunction with Puriel to make a leather-bound book that detailed the hierarchy of demons, and all their evolutions up to Demon Lord. It was a little bit more information than the Eastern Empire's demon slayers had, but was a whole lot more than what the Free Guild had. This would be plenty, he figured, while not giving away any information that could really harm his spawn. After all, he had holy demonic reversal that he could use on them to negate most of their weaknesses anyway. Handing the book to Yuki, the guild master skimmed through it, and his eyes widened. This is some pretty comprehensive information. I know better than to ask where you got this, so I won't ask. Now, what information did you want in exchange? He asked with the book set down on his desk. Lucian made a show of thinking about it for a bit before shrugging. I can't decide right now. How about I pick what I want as part of the deal later? Sound good? He said, in response to which Yuki agreed. After that they shook hands and Lucian left the building to where his party was waiting for. Shizu asked him what he'd wanted to talk to the guild master about as they headed to a nearby inn. Just wanted to apologize for Alfred's stunt is all, he told her, getting a nod in response. Later that night Lucian sat in on his bed for the night, and thought to himself. I picked the information about the unique skill creator, he thought while focusing on the deal he'd made with Yuki. For a moment he was afraid it wouldn't work, that was until Puriel chimed in. Information on unique skill creator has been gained through the unique skill soul beginning analysis of the information now the skill told him. Lucian went to bed that night with a wide smile on his face. He now had another trump card in the making, of course he'd be happy. The next morning after meeting up with Yuki the party of 6 made their way to the church. Yuki had come through and gotten Shizu in for a slot shortly before noon that day. All headed to see her off on her departure. Yuki had stayed back at the guild to keep up with his workload and to try and draw less attention to them. It was a good move as they would have likely been swarmed otherwise. Yuki was a big name in this world and especially in this city after all. So as they made their way to the church Lucian thought back to last night. Specifically, about the information on creator he now had. It turns out that this unique skill was far more complex than most and Puriel was taking some time to fully scan it and understand it enough to replicate it safely. If Puriel got it wrong even a little bit it could lead to disaster, especially since the skill used soul energy for its abilities. His ultimate skill was also taking the chance to alter the skill somewhat to make it be usable intentionally by him instead of only instinctively like Yuki was limited to. That was fine though for Lucian, he didn't need the skill right this moment, and having it be a more easily usable version was worth the wait in his mind. Regardless, they had made it to the church now, and it was something else. It was a building larger than some noble estates he'd seen, and was made from white, silver, and gold-colored materials. The building looked like a stereotypical chapel in terms of architecture with stained glass windows depicting the god Luminous. Entering the building the group was met by a man in white priest robes that led them deeper into the building once Shizu showed her ID. They walked past many different rooms, from large rooms for worship with pews lined up to a dining hall for the clergy. Even an armory with swords that seemed to have a weak holy element to them from what Lucian could sense. Eventually they were brought down some stairs and into a large chamber made of stone. In the center of the chamber was a large magic circle carved into the ground and the carving filled in with silver. Around the circle stood 6 other men in white robes that the men who led them joined once they entered. When you're ready please enter the circle, and we will perform the chant needed to activate the portal, was all the priest said as he took his place among his fellow holy men. Shizu turned to them then, and went one by one to say her goodbyes. First was Blake. Blake, you've grown so much since I first met you. You continue to impress me with your determination, and I see remarkable things in your future. I'm incredibly proud of all that you've accomplished, she told him, and gave him a hug. Thank you Shizu, I appreciate all you have done for me, and for being there for us, he said to her with some tears in the corners of his eyes. Before Shizu separated from him she whispered one last thing into his ear. Make sure to keep an eye out for Lucian, I feel he's likely to get in over his head soon. It woman's intuition, she said jokingly making the redhead chuckle, and nod as the hug ended. Next, she went to Alice and Alfred, the 2 siblings looking sad to see her go. I've been with the 2 of you since the beginning, so I feel like I know you both well. Stay out of trouble you 2. I don't want your sire's hair to get even grayer after all, she said. tears coming to her eyes at having to say goodbye to these two who she'd helped raise almost. The two demons preempted her and hugged the one they saw as the closest they had to a mother figure. "We promise we'll make sure to not cause too much trouble," they both said at the same time, as despite their differing personalities they were truly alike in many ways. After the hug with the siblings ended, she stood before Surtur. The giant held out a hand to shake, not sure if he was close enough to her to go for a hug. Such worries were proven needless as she ignored his outstretched hand and gave him a hug as well. "Take care, Surtur, I know you'll protect them well," she told him, making the large man smile and nod to her. "I'll make sure they all get back to you whole and healthy, my lady," he said to her with a jovial grin. She nodded at the man and finally made her way to Lucian, the last of those she needed to say goodbye to. "So you're off to see that wayward student of yours, it seems," Lucian said, looking her in the eyes and noticing the tears that had started to fall. The own dampness in his own eyes he firmly ignored, of course. "So it seems," she said as she stood before him, a watery smile on her face now. They both went in for a hug at the same time, holding each other tightly. They were like that for a long while, a little too long if the not subtle fake cough from one of the priests was to go. They then separated from each other, but before they had fully done so, Shizu, surprised, she gave him a peck on the cheek before quickly running off to the center of the circle. Lucian stared at her, seeing her blushing face as the robed men began to chant. As the circle began to glow with a bright light, she waved goodbye to them all. Then, in a flash, she was. Lucian turned to look at his companions only to see them all having a shit-eating grin on their faces that made him blush now as well. Turning away, he made to walk out of the room. Out of sight of the others, though, he put a hand up to his cheek where the black-haired swordswoman had kissed him, and smiled a somewhat dopey smile. At least he had something good to remember her by now. Edited, January 27, 2026. Chapter 25. Chapter 24. After leaving the church, Lucian's companions came out as well. The group then made their way to the edge of the city, having no further business left in the city. They had plenty of supplies and even a destination in mind. They were to head south now for the next part of their journey to see more of the world. Lucian had also heard some chatter about increasing monster activity near the western foot of the Kusha Mountains. That was something that smelled of the chance to grow stronger to him, and thus intrigued him. Yuki wasn't expecting them, or anything either, so with Shizu now gone they had no need to stay longer. Plus, it was unfair to have Surtur keep being in his smaller form. It was a tad uncomfortable to hold for overly lengthy periods of time, the giant had confessed when Lucian pressed, so leaving the human settlement was for the best. After a short walk they had made it out of the city, and were once more on the open road, so to speak. Lucian turned to face his group after making some distance between them and the city. "Let's go and get stronger so that the next time Shizu sees us she'll be too stunned for words," he said to them, and received an answering cheer in response. It had been a month since they had left the capital city of Ingracia. In that time, they'd made their way through the countries of Ingracia and Blumend and reached the country to the direct south of Blumend. This country was known as the Kingdom of Malstance, and its territory extended from the southern border of Blumend to the northern border of Sarayan. Kingdom of Raja took up a small part of the territory on their eastern border, while the country's western border formed just south of Balakia. In total it was slightly bigger than both Blumend and Balakia combined, though wasn't known for being as big of a power, as the Kingdom of Malstance bordered the Sarayan dynasty, a nation that had no true interest in forging trade deals with any nation that was a part of the Western Council, which Malstance was a part of. They also bordered the mountainous region of the Forest of Jura, and thus were also close to the domain of the Sky Queen Frey. This all resulted in the country not being in the most advantageous position, often attacked by monsters from the mountains on their eastern border. To compound this, the nation's kings had been known to spend most of their resources on trying to conquer the Raja kingdom for their gold instead of investing in their own territory. The only thing the country had going for it was its large military force compared to the surrounding nations, and ironically, the trade with the Raja kingdom that gained them gold from the small nation in exchange for food and other resources. Now though, as for why Lucian had brought his group here was twofold. First, and less importantly, Lucian wanted to see this nation that hadn't been spoken of in the series he had read in his past life. The chatter he'd heard back in Ingracia had only grown as they traveled, and it painted a picture of a country facing a crisis. That country was Malstance itself. From what he was able to find out, the nation was facing an invasion from the east. Group of trolls, usually monsters around C-to-B rank that traveled sparingly from their mountain homes. Even when they did go beyond their rocky caves, they did so alone. Though they were moving in mass, an army of hundreds led by a far more intelligent one of their kind. This was causing massive problems for the nation's eastern land, though the nation's capital in the west didn't care much. They had sent a token effort of 500 men from their army that numbered in the thousands. So the villages and towns there were left as easy pickings for the monsters and adventurers that had been coming to help in place of the nation's military. So Lucian had a plan now. He and his companions were going to try and eradicate this threat in their effort to grow stronger. First though, they were heading to the nation's capital. Lucian wished to make a deal with the king to resolve this problem. Now normally this would have been a foolish endeavor, but something had changed for Lucian and Blake in this. During this past month they'd been killing any monster that they found threatening others, a common enough occurrence this close to the great forest of Jura. From isolated villages to lost hunters, traveling merchants too poor to hire an escort to rookie teams of adventurers that had bit off more than they could handle. They had saved them all, with the demon siblings and Surtur aiding as well. Due to this, Lucian and Blake had been gaining a reputation from their exploits. In the end, many of the adventurers they had saved had even told guild officials about it all, and thus the officials recommended them for A-rank promotion. Apparently, from what they had been told when the group arrived at a guild hall before entering the kingdom of Malstance, when Yuki saw it cross his desk he had chuckled and gave them the rank. Not many knew why the guild master did this, but Lucian had an idea. He knew they had been taught by Shizu, the woman herself, even speaking of their skills when she'd spoken with him in the capital. So, it was likely that Yuki took that into account, and just gave them the after all. Shizu's other students were himself and Hinata, and they were both extremely. Now though, with him and Blake's status as a ranks and possessing a reputation for their skill, Lucian thought that making a deal with the king was possible. It wasn't unheard of for such deals to be made with A-rank adventurers, though often with nobles and lords instead of. He planned on helping them either way, of course. Lucian just thought that the chance for some extra gold wasn't something to pass on. That gold could be used to make a base for themselves, a place to plan their next moves and train in more specialized facilities he could only make in a more permanent location. Plus, getting Blake a forge would be nice, as well as getting Alice a proper lab for her magical experiments. That all led to now, the group of 6 heading into the capital city of Malstance. Couldn't just show up to a nation's king demanding an audience, of course, so Lucian needed that plan was to go to the local branch of the Free Guild that was housed in the capital. So the group of 5 went to the large building near the outskirts of the city, and went up to the main desk. Lucian waited in line for a bit and soon was in front of the main desk. The lady that was stationed there looked bored and asked what it was he was there for. Well, Lucian began and handed over his guild ID. I wish to meet with the king to discuss a proposition. The guild worker looked unimpressed at first. Yeah, so does every random adventurer dash. She stopped once she registered what his ID stated. An A-rank ID wasn't something she'd seen beyond the training course she took for this job, detailing all she needed to know for it. Regardless, she knew what it was with but a glance. The large red A in the corner made it A-rank. Adventurers were rare, the names of such individuals known throughout the land as great warriors. It was said that a single one of them was worth over 100 soldiers in terms of strength. It was also then, as she looked at the ID more closely, that she noticed the name printed on it. Lucian Silver, one of the newest A-ranks that just so happened to travel with the other newest A-rank. This request just went from a ludicrous thing to a lifeline. She had worked at this guild hall for a few years now, so she knew such an individual and his party wouldn't be here making such a request for no reason. She also knew of the trouble with the trolls in the east, something the kingdom wasn't handling well at all. With all that in mind, the guild worker cut herself off and said something else instead. "Let me get the guild master for you," she said instead, and went off to go do so. Luke was not a strongman, he knew that. Sure, he was a solid A in rank here at the guild, promoted to a rank after being appointed guild master. But that was not nearly close to strong enough for this world, and he knew it. Luke was the third son of a noble family that had taken to adventuring since he didn't stand to inherit anything. He had done well for himself, but in his travels he'd run into a few powerhouses and seen just what the real world expected of those called heroes. Luke had seen the Conqueror of Flames once years ago, and he knew he stood no chance against such a foe. He also knew that the demon lords and true chosen heroes were even greater. Being of noble blood gave him the resources needed to go looking for knowledge on the strong. After seeing Shizu in action, he had gone on a search for such and came away humbled. He knew no other noble would believe him, to understand what he did now. That for all their bluster and so-called power, no noble truly had anything close to real power. That, if they really wanted to, the demon lords could eradicate them all quite easily. There was no chosen hero right now to contest them after all. So he decided to stay with the guild even back then when it was the Mutual Aid Association. He spent his time helping other adventurers, giving them advice and warnings of the real world as best he could. When the MAA became the Free Guild, his efforts were recognized in tandem with his noble background, and was thus made the guild master for Malston's branch. As someone raised in the circles of the elite, he could serve as a bridge between the nobles and the adventurers, so it made sense. So, when he was told that an A rank and his party wished to speak with him, he was hopeful. Some of the adventurers he had trained had gone to fight those trolls in the east, and he worried about them. To have a true A rank go to aid them would set his mind at. With all this in mind, his past and present together, he told the woman who'd come to him about this to lead them in. Whatever kind of deal he needed to broker, he was ready to do so. The people deserved that much from him. Lucian and his party were led to the guild master's office by the same lady that had met them at the desk. She seemed to be in a rush and somewhat flustered. Not something he didn't. A ranks were big deals in this world, especially when a nation was facing a crisis. Soon enough they were in front of a dark brown door made from oak that she opened for them, motioning to head inside. Once in the room proper, Lucian and co got their first look at the guild master of Malstance. He was an older man, likely in his mid to late 40s from the looks of his graying blonde hair and slight smile lines. He possessed green eyes that were like tarnished jade, holding a look that spoke of knowing and experience. The man was dressed in a simple enough outfit, a stylish black overcoat with a white dress shirt underneath. Enough for formal events without being overly so. The man didn't seem too powerful from what he could tell, a little stronger than Blake was pre-evolution. It seemed his true power lay in knowledge instead. The old adage of respect those that grow old in a profession where most die young came to mind. In all, Lucian had a good impression of the man. The guild master stood up when they entered, showing his dress slacks as he did so were black to match his overcoat. "It's good to meet you all, my name is Guildmaster Luke. You can just call me Luke," he said while holding his hand out with a smile on his face. Lucian took the man's hand and gave it a shake as the others took a seat in the available chairs inside the room. After the handshake ended, Lucian sat down in the chair directly opposite the man's own as he sat in his own chair once more. They sat there for a moment, merely looking at one another as if to gauge the other's character. The silence was broken by Luke though soon enough. "So, I'm told you have a request for me. What would that happen to be?" Luke asked with a raised eyebrow, betraying nothing in his words. Lucian looked the man dead in the eye as he spoke his request. "We'd like an audience with the king if at all possible," he said plainly, voice steady with the confidence of one who knew their worth. "For what purpose?" the middle-aged guild master asked now, curious and hopeful but doing well not to show it. Lucian looked at his companions, getting nods from them all as he did so. They trusted him to do what was best. If he was leading them into a battle, all they would ask is who there. In this case he'd already told them what he had planned, and they were more than ready to go. First though they had to try and see if they could get paid first, Either way they had trolls to kill, as they would not be leaving the citizens to defend themselves from such. Lucian, now having confirmed with his group, spoke once more. I wish to offer the king a deal, he told the men before him. And what would this deal entail exactly, the men asked back. Lucian grinned a sharp grin, one the guild master soon returned at his next words. Why, the eradication of those trolls to the east, of course, was his answer. Luke's smile was just as sharp as Lucian's own at that. I think an audience could be arranged then, Luke said, hoping once more in his heart that he hadn't sent those young warriors to die now that someone with real strength was here. Only hoped that the king wasn't foolish enough to deny this aid. A blond man sighed, seeing as his breath misted in the cold morning air. He wished that was smoke instead, a cigarette would be so nice right now. But this world didn't have a gas station he could go to for a pack. No, tobacco was for the rich and smoked primarily in pipes and cigars instead. His little brother had told him to quit, guess now he had his wish. He'd been summoned to this world alongside another man, from 2 different worlds to boot. Right after coming to, he had been enchained by the court mages, made a slave and told to be a soldier. He didn't mind the fighting, in fact the chance to fight those that could actually take a hit was fun. It was the lack of freedom that made him so annoyed. At least he was handling it better than his new companion most days. His new friend's name was Bullet, and he'd apparently been some kind of freedom fighter in his world. It made sense why he hated this so much while the blonde had been nothing but the muscle for a debt collector. He didn't like it, but it didn't burn like it did for Bullet. None of that mattered right now though. Now they were stationed at the eastern border of the nation they'd been summoned by. Told to use their strength to protect them from some trolls. They hadn't seen any yet, but it was only a matter of time before the fight came. A fight he would win, his freakish strength finally good for something in this world. Plus, his unique skill that he got from coming to this world finally gave him something he'd always wanted. Hey, Shirzwa. We're going to be moving out soon for another base. Better stop your brooding. And hurry over, the muscled man with a pompadour shouted at him. That was Bullet, larger than life with the size to prove it. He had initially been annoyed with the man's teasing attitude, until he realized it was his way of getting his mind off their situation. He couldn't blame him then, being a slave in all but name was not something he ever thought he'd face, and if that was the man's way of coping then he'd not fault him for it. Heh, seems I've changed a bit in this world, he said to himself under his breath, as he stood up from where he was leaning. It was true though, normally he'd simply get angry and start punching if someone kept pressing his buttons like Bullet did. But as they say, hard times make for strange bedfellows. Now he had a guy who seemed to try and act like those big brothers from stories he had seen. Supportive, teasing, and there for you. Shirzwa wondered if he'd been able to control his strength back then, if he could have been that for his own brother. Maybe, maybe not. Matter now though, his little brother was a movie star now, and he was finally in a world that didn't fear him. Now if only I could get rid of this stupid curse, he said while passing the mun, getting a nod from Bullet at those words. One day we'll be free, my friend. Until then though, I'll fight right by your side, Bullet told him with a grin that hid his own desperate wish for freedom as best it could. Shirzwa smiled back despite himself. It was things like this that made him wonder. Where was someone like you back in Ikebukuro? He asked to himself as he headed off to journey to the next base. Edited, January 27, 2026. Chapter 26. Chapter 25. Guildmaster Luke told them he would have an answer on whether or not they had an audience within the next few hours. It was only due to the fact that the party of 5 had arrived early in the day that they weren't going to have to wait till the next day. That. The guildmaster had a good amount of sway in the court due to the situation at hand. And the others had gone to a local inn in the meantime, having been told to return to the guild in 4 hours. After renting 2 rooms, one for Lucian, Blake and Surtur with the other being for the demon siblings, the group went off to look at the local shops and such. The business in the capital seemed to cater to the higher end of the social spectrum from what they could see. Instead of taverns and weapon shops like in other places, they saw more boutiques and fancy restaurants. Jewelers were more common than potion sellers, tailors more numerous than armor smiths. It was a strange thing for them, not having been in a city like this before really. In Ingracia the capital catered to adventurers and civilians, both due to the guild headquarters being there. Dworgen was also quite different, being a city of smiths. The capital was in no shortage of weapon shops and the like. So to see such a lack of shops for weapons and survival gear was strange to say the least. It was only when they got to the outer edge of the city that they saw things like general stores and supply shops. After doing a bit of shopping, the group went back to the guild to wait for word from Luke. They'd mainly bought some new food items that they hadn't seen before, spices primarily. Besides that, Blake had bought a whetstone for weapon maintenance as he'd taken on the role for the group due to his training as a smith back in Dworgen. Not that their weapons needed sharpening much due to their quality, but apparently it was calming to the young men. Though they waited in the guild's reception area, Lucian looked forward to his first look at royalty in this life. Luke collected them within the next hour and told them they'd been approved for, and after that he led them up to the royal castle, assuring guards that they were expected once they reached the gate leading into the castle grounds. The castle was a large piece of architecture made of white stone with goldenwood accents. It looked like it was taken right out of a storybook, classic English design and all. A good amount of effort had been taken to make the three-spired monolith to royal power both inviting and intimidating. At the colors give the veneer of benevolence, with the size serving as a display of regardless of the building's design. Though they walked forward, Luke led them through halls filled with artwork and laid out in a sprawl that seemed purposely misleading to most in the group, though the twisting turns were simple enough to memorize for Lucian, especially due to Puriel. It was likely made this way to confuse intruders, spies and the like. Would work against most humans anyway. Eventually they were led to the throne room where the king and his advisors were. At the king and his court, and Lucian was disappointed. The king was large to the point of excess, looking almost too big for his throne. This size wasn't due to muscle though, like he imagined Gazel might be. Instead it was fat and weight gained from feasting rather than. His face was severe as well, looking like a man that was used to scowling more than. If Lucian were to liken him to someone, it would be Walder Frey from Game of. Though perhaps Lucian's expectations for a ruler were off, he admitted to himself. Not all can be hero kings or demon lords, he thought, the memories of the other rulers he knew flashing in his mind. It wasn't necessarily the Nephilim's fault though. He knew of kings like Gazel, Yum, and queens like Frey and Elmesia, and other rulers that showed great power. Even Gran Bel was a sophisticated-looking gentleman. So to see a king like the one before him was a bit of a surprise, especially with how the nation's few things to boast of were its military. Had been expecting a warrior king to go along with such a reputation, to be honest. Advisors didn't inspire much confidence either. There were 3 such men with a 4th near the back. The 3 men were nobles of some sort, it seemed. One wore a powdered wig and had a look of superiority on his face when looking upon them. The second had brown hair and had gaunt, weasel-like features to his face, and eyes that spoke of greed like some of the less reputable merchants Lucian had met. The third was tall and stalwart, black of hair, and seemed to be the only one Lucian didn't hold misgivings about. He possessed a muscular build and seemed to be uncomfortable in his fancy clothes, giving the sense that he was more comfortable on the battlefield than in the. Finally was the young man in the back. He was dressed in the finest clothes, and from the circlet around his head seemed to be the prince. He was thin as a stick and possessed a sharp look to his face. A sneer seemed more natural on his face than the smile he gave, as if it was a mask he didn't often wear. Suddenly I'm feeling a lot less guilty about asking for coin from these guys, Lucian thought to himself jokingly. He wasn't going to ignore his instincts regarding these men though. They hadn't failed him yet after all. Once finally in front of the king, Luke bowed for a moment while Lucian and the others stood. They weren't this man's subjects, and something in Lucian detested the idea of bowing to anyone. Perhaps it was his demonic side not wishing to bow to any he felt were weaker than him. He wasn't sure, but it mattered not but for the sneer on the prince's face at the perceived disrespect. "I am the king of this great nation, King Baltus Malstance III. Why have you come before me, adventure?" The king said, a booming voice coming from his mouth that echoed in the large throne room. Lucian took a step forward before addressing his question. "I have come to discuss an offer for you. I offer for me and my companions to get rid of the trolls troubling your eastern border, for due compensation," he said to the king, the natural charisma of a man who's made deals as much as he had leaking through. The king took in this request and laughed aloud. "You think you can take all those beasts yourself? What foolishness," he said, getting nods from most of his court bar one. The man with black hair stepped forward and spoke to his king. "My liege, I implore you to hear this man out. An A-rank is not some lowly sellsword that merely kills bandits, but a warrior that can begin to be considered a hero in their own right. This man before us offers not only the aid of one such individual but two. From what my younger brother says, the others of their number are not far behind either as well. Such a force may indeed handle such a threat," the man said, pointing at Luke when mentioning his at the man's words. The king and the others took on an expression of thought. It was the wigged man that spoke up first. "Lord Noctis may have a point. Besides, the trolls are causing us problems in the collecting of taxes in that region, and harming our trade with the Raja kingdom," he said at last, getting a nod from the king, and a scowl from the greedy-looking man next to him at the mention of lost trade. The brown-haired man spoke next after his fellow advisor finished. "He's right, my liege, and if we lose out on more trade revenue from the Raja kingdom, it may begin to cut into our spending. It has been going on for some time, after all, and using this group of adventurers would save us from committing our forces to the east," he said, looking more worried over the spending than the commitment of arms. The king took all this in before turning to Lucian once more. "You're certain you can do as you say, adventure?" he asked, almost daring him to say no and to admit to having wasted his time. Lucian smirked, ignoring the man's continued refusal to use his name before responding. "Certainly, your majesty. Me and mine can handle this threat with no issue," he told the king. It was the brown-haired man that spoke up next at those words. "And how much are you asking to be paid for this service?" the noble said with a smirk of his. Lucian paused as if to consider what to ask for in exchange. "I think 500 gold coins is a fair asking price," he said with a smile on his face. "I'd be more than willing to await payment upon completion, of course, for such a price." At the mention of waiting to be paid after services rendered, the king and his court calmed from their look of outrage. It wasn't that such a price was beyond their means of paying. They spent more on the soldiers they had sent to the east in a month than that, after all, when you took supplies into account. It was more so the fact that a man they saw as below them asking for such so brazenly that had elicited that reaction. But to wait for payment, not even asking for any upfront, made them more at ease with the idea. The king conferred with his advisors for a bit before addressing Lucian once more. "I believe those would be acceptable terms. We have a deal then. Get rid of the trolls and you'll have your gold," the king said as if giving a decree. Lucian smiled at those words. "Yes, we have a deal, your majesty," he said, smiles on his friends' faces at the confirmation. After all that was done, Lucian left with his group immediately for the eastern territory. Had led them out of the castle, unknowing that they could have easily gotten out through the winding paths themselves. Once they were gone and the throne room was left with only the nobles and royals, the king spoke up. "At last, this blasted troll issue will be taken care of, even if we do have to pay some common brigand to do so," King Baltus said aloud to his court. Lord Noctis looked uncomfortable at the king's words. To call such a man and his companions as such was a great disservice. Unlike others in the kingdom, he took his younger brother's words seriously when he spoke of the true power in this world. He had only gotten so far due to his military accomplishments, and thus had been in charge of the training and testing of the otherworlders summoned. Noctis had been told by his brother that even they were likely to struggle against one such as Shizu Izawa or Hinata Sakaguchi. Not to mention the likes of the demon lords. For a man like Shirzwa to be considered of the minimum amount of strength needed to stand as someone noteworthy in this world was a wake-up call. Such men made numbers a meaningless thing in truth, and all the nation of Malstance had to its name was numbers and good steel. It didn't help that after years of service and combat he'd developed a bit of sense for how dangerous others were. And that silver-haired man registered as the highest threat he'd ever sensed. Unbeknownst to Noctis, this was actually the result of his extra skill, strength sense. Been developed over the many battles his king had sent him into and survived each one. Resulted in him accruing enough power to manifest such a skill, though he himself thought it was nothing more than soldier's intuition. That was part of the reason he'd been so quick to speak up about the men to the king, a man like that was just what they needed now. All this led to the following talk being quite uncomfortable to him. "Well, my king, who says we need pay him? I see no written contract, no witnesses but ourselves to this deal. Why, I think that man spoke of offering his help free of charge. In fact, the Lord placed in charge of finances, Lord Grandmont, said in that slimy voice of his. The wigged form of Count Esker nodded along to the merchant in noble's clothes. "Yes indeed, my liege, a commoner like that should only be happy to offer to aid the kingdom free of charge," he said while trying to sound more important than he really was. The prince chooses that moment to speak up. "Indeed, father, that disrespectful cretin does not deserve a single coin from our coffers. If he tries to cause a problem, I'm sure our summoned friends could deal with him if it came to it," the prince told his father, more concerned at what he saw as disrespect than the people dying in the east. Seeing his king nod, Noctis grew cold. A man like Lucian would not take kindly to this, he could tell. One of such restrained power was not one to double-cross, that way led to disaster. He knew though that his words would go unheeded, knew they wouldn't take the words of such a minor lord to heart despite his service. He was here more so to report than to advise, regardless of his title of military advisor. The king and his son thought themselves strategists and leaders of men like their forebears, despite the fact neither had so much as wielded a. All Noctis could do was prepare, tell the men loyal to him to be ready, and get his house in that sense of his had told him to be wary of Lucian and his companions, and it hadn't steered him wrong yet. The worst that would come of this would be him overreacting after, though a part of him, the part that had kept him alive all these years, told him he wasn't. "I'll have let Luke know when I have the chance, though it will likely be too late," he thought to himself, unable to leave yet as he still had duties to attend to. It had been about a day since the talks with the king, and Lucian thought they were making good time on getting to the eastern border. After being led out of the castle, the group had given their farewells to Luke and headed off from the city immediately. In a way they had been a tad rude, but none of them, especially Lucian and Blake, wanted to waste any more time that could be spent saving the people from the trolls. Lucian already felt a tad guilty delaying in order to speak with the king in the first place. He knew though that they needed that gold in order to properly settle down for a while. Couldn't just roam forever and ever, that would hamper them more than anything in the long base of operations was the intended use for that money, to finally have a place he could call his own in this world. There he and Alice could begin to test their theories, and they all could devote themselves to growing stronger. They had time until the world came accepting its due, or at least he hoped so. They had decided to stop for the night in a clearing near the main road, a muddy thing barely deserving the name of road. A fire was set up and the group's sleeping gear was put in its place all ready for them to begin again the next morning. If Lucian remembered the map right, they only had another day and a half to go at this pace, something that would make most humans balk in shock. For a normal horse-drawn carriage to cover the distance they had in just this afternoon would take several days. To get from the capital to the eastern border it would be over a week and a half. This speed was only possible due to their group's incredible physicality, and Blake having incredible stamina. The other part of what allowed them to move so fast was that they weren't holding back right now like they normally do. When normally traveling they try and keep to a human pace, to stop and smell the roses if you will. It lets them find more opportunities than if they simply rushed to all their destinations. Now though they were on a mission, one with lives on the line. As Lucian looked across the flames of the fire at his companions, his family, he smiled a soft soon he'd have the ability to give them a home. A place to call their own, where they need not fear the world judging them for their differences. For how Alice and Alfred were demons, ignoring their loyalty and kindness. For how Blake called monsters his family, ignoring his strength and caring personality. For how Surtur was something that shouldn't be, ignoring the fact that he was the gentlest soul he knew who wished for nothing more than friendship. In time he'd give them a home. A home for the ones he swore to protect. For the ones he will die for, live for, and kill for. I guess I got what I wanted now. All it took was dying, Lucian said to himself, his voice covered by the fire. He was right, he now had what he wanted more than anything in his previous life. A place to belong, for that was what they were. These people around him were his place to belong no matter where they were in the world. Dying didn't feel like a bad price to pay to him if this is what it got him. Unknown to Lucian though, soon this family of his would be threatened. And when that day came, a reckoning would come forth for those that dared to do so. Soon, the world will change, and Lucian will enter the world's stage far sooner than he wanted. But a man like him would never be able to remain away from it, not in this world. Edited, January 27, 2026. Chapter 27, Chapter 26. It was 2 days later that Lucian and the others made it to the outpost they'd been told about. It was here that the nation of Malstans had set up their command center for the ongoing conflict. It was a large square-shaped building that reached 3 stories high. Stone Construct was an old military outpost that hadn't been used in years that had been reman due to its proximity to the troll horde. Arriving at the manned entrance, Lucian explained the situation and showed them his ID. The men at the entrance sagged in relief at seeing a party led by an A-rank show up, not even really caring at this point whether he had been sent by the king or not. Their eyes held a dullness to them, as if they'd seen things that no man wished to see. From what Lucian knew of trolls' preferred diet, it didn't surprise him to see them have that look in their eyes. After being cleared, the party went into the building in hopes of speaking with the commander for an update on the position of their quarry. Led through the stone building by one of the 2 entrance guards, they passed barracks full of soldiers, both in fighting shape and many that were far from so. Other rooms had separate men guarding them, likely weapon and supply rooms if Lucian were to guess. The reason extra security was placed for such rooms was clear. Desperation leads to many problems after all. He preferred to focus on his reason for being here though, to end this conflict quickly. Eventually the party of 5 were taken to a room on the 2nd floor that was one of the few in the possession of a door. The guard knocked on the door and waited a moment before receiving permission to enter from a harrowed voice inside. He opened the door and told the men inside that they had guests that had come to help. After being given the okay to let them in, Lucian and his group were let inside. The room was smaller than expected, only slightly larger than the inn room that Lucian and Blake shared during their time in Dworgen. The small space was being used to the fullest, however. A large map spread across both the far wall, and the table placed in the center of the A-desk was placed in the one corner, and was filled with papers. Upon the table were miniatures carved from wood that, while crude, seemed to depict the men and the trolls' positions as well as a separate marker for territory lost. On the wall map were pins of both green and red placed over settlements with their names scribbled underneath. All that was clocked in a moment by Lucian and his group, but it was the men that gave Lucian pause. There were 4 other men in the room besides them, and the guard who had. The first 2 weren't shocking to see. A man dressed in light armor that stood at the head of the table possessing light brown hair and stressed, youthful features. The other an older man garbed in a robe, and holding a weathered staff of wood, hair gray from age. Were clearly the commander of the troops and a mage sent by the kingdom. The only thing Lucian felt out of place with the 2 was the young age of the commander. The other 2 were different. For one, the slightly taller man had a pompadour, which was a hairstyle far from normal in this world. Second, both felt familiar to him for some reason. Like Lucian had seen someone who looked like the 2 men, but it had been somewhat distorted. It was clear though that the 2 were otherworlders. One of them looked Japanese except for the blonde hair, and the other had the information hairstyle. He decided to focus on the commander for now though and possibly inquire later about if these two were strays that joined up willingly or summons that had been forced. "Hello, I apologize but I must be blunt. Who are you people and what is it that you want?" the commander said, voice betraying how tired and harrowed he was from his deployment. Lucian gave a comforting smile, wanting to put the young man at ease. This man was barely old enough to be considered as such, looking close to Blake's age if he were to guess. He wasn't one to judge ability based on age, especially in this world. However, from what he could sense, this young man was barely stronger than the average soldier here, and not some special combat prodigy. It worried him, to be honest, how such a young man was put into such a straining position. So the Nephilim decided to be kind to the man, not wishing to add to his. "No apologies are necessary, it is only proper that I introduce us. My name is Lucian Silver, a rank adventurer and leader of this group," he said in a calm voice before motioning to his companions one by one. "This is Blake, our second A rank, and my little brother," Lucian said to introduce the redhead who waved at the commander. "Next is Alice and Alfred, siblings who are both B rank adventurers who specialize in magic and physical combat respectively," the Nephilim said with a prude tint to his voice as he introduced his spawn, the two in question giving a polite nod at the words. "And finally, our tank, Surtur, who is also B rank," the tall man grinned and bowed at the introduction from his lord. As each member was introduced, the commander's eyes widened bit by bit. A party such as this was incredibly powerful after all. 1A rank was strong enough to be considered a hero, so for there to be two of them and backed up by a trio of B ranks, that was more power than all his men could muster even if they were fully rested. It wouldn't surprise him if one or more of them were enlightened even, the commander only knowing of such a thing from tales spoken of by more senior officers. This could be just what he needed to change those bastards in the capital may not have sent any more troops, but this could end up being far better, he thought to himself, hope blooming in his chest. "It's good to meet you all, my name is Richard, and I'm the commander of the military effort to exterminate the trolls plaguing our eastern border," the now named Richard said as a way of introduction. After a moment, the brown-haired man spoke once more. "May I ask why you have come here, adventurers?" Richard asked, a slight tint of hope in his voice he tried his best to cover up. Lucian smiled once more at the young man. "Why, to kill the trolls of course," he said, voice calm and blasé as if stating a fact he found to be obvious. Richard could have collapsed from how relieved those words made him feel. Shirzwa watched on as the young commander spoke with Lucian and the others. He could tell these newcomers were strong, even without their rank being told to them. From the look he and Bulat shared, he knew his partner in slavery was of the same mind. These people were strong, maybe even stronger than them. That was not something they had expected. After all, they hadn't seen anyone that was a match for them strength-wise since arriving here a year and a half ago. That wasn't ego talking for them either, it was simple truth. None of the kingdom's soldiers were stronger than them, and it took over 30 mages to summon them in the first place. Even the lock spells placed on them required one of the senior mages to be with them in order to reinforce every 2 weeks or so. That was more due to the lacking magical knowledge in this nation, though, from what they overheard from their keepers muttering. Malstans put more effort into physical might than magical, it seemed, and thus didn't give many resources to their magic users. That led to most skilled magic users leaving the country for another, more magically powerful nation, leaving only those who were too weak or too loyal. Thus the shoddy lock spell they used on the two of them. From what Bulat had heard and then told Shirzwa one day after guarding the king, the nation only had access to the summoning ritual due to some contact in the Council of the West. Now here they were, sent to the eastern border to aid the troops against the threat the trolls posed. However, the king had given their handler specific instructions: don't risk the weapons. Weapons in question, of course, being them. So instead of using their power and skill to take out this threat, or try to at least, they were sent to deal with offshoots of the monster forces. Scattered beasts that had been driven out by the advancing trolls, a few trolls themselves that seemed to be outriders, and even a few undead that came from some of the villages they were too late to save. Shirzwa may not have considered himself a righteous or heroic individual, quite the opposite in fact, but he hated not being able to help to his fullest. But if he was feeling frustrated and being held back and unable to help, then Bulat was furious. The black-haired men detested how the innocent were left on their own, how their handler commanded them to fall back instead of pursuing, how they had encountered more than enough villages full of women and children all slaughtered, with the men being found dead outside the walls with weapons. And Bulat hid his rage though, kept cool, and joked with Shirzwa, and the men that saw them as more than weapons. One such person being Richard himself. Richard was young but a good commander, though he wasn't supposed to have been the one in charge, and it showed. Sometimes. No, Richard had been fresh from military training, but 6 months prior, and had only dealt with bandits and the like before coming to the east. When the call for men to go tackle the trolls came, he decided to go, having wished to aid his county men. Richard had been a rank-and-file soldier up until about 2 months ago. That had changed when all the senior command had been wiped out in an assault by the trolls. All except for the mage handler and the 2 summons. Shirzwa and Bulat had wanted to help, but the one who held their reins commanded them to guard him as they retreated. Their curses forced them to obey, even as they fought with all they could not to leave the men to their fate. After that incident, their handler wrote to the king and asked for orders. The king refused to send more men or any senior officer. When it came to who to put in charge, the king had simply said to have the most skilled among them be in charge. For a while no one at their encampment knew what to do with that information. They didn't wish to fight to find out who was best after all. Not when they could be attacked at any time. It was only after the camp was attacked by dire wolves that a decision was made. During the attack, Richard had grown frustrated and didn't wish to see his comrades die, so he took charge of them. His leadership was rough, but it resulted in them winning the encounter. So the men chose him as their new commander. Shirzwa, like Richard, didn't see him and Bulat as lesser. He saw them as fellow men fighting for the safety of the people. This wasn't always the case, of course. When he first took command, he had screamed at the 2 otherworlders for leaving so many to die. It was only after they told him of the lock curse placed on them, and their handler foolishly confirming, he gave them the order did Richard stop. Their handler had gotten reprimanded to the extent of Richard's ability to do so, and had apologized to the 2 of them after that. Over these past months they grew close to the young man, Bulat giving the newbie leader some help with how to lead using his own experience in the military to help. Shirzwa on the other hand did his best to take on guard shifts at night, and in more dangerous areas, often needing to do so after the mage fell asleep. This let Richard and the men sleep easier knowing that he was watching out for them. Shirzwa was strong after all, even before being summoned to this world. He was known for ripping out street signs to use as weapons and throwing vending machines back home. Though from what the summoning did, he was far stronger. Initially he was prepared to be feared even more, only to have his expectations unmet in the worst of ways. His strength didn't make him feared, it made him a tool. That was until coming here and Richard taking now his strength was seen as something good, something that could be used to protect instead of hurt. Now though, these newcomers were here. When Richard introduced them he saw the silver-haired one's eyes widen, but it wasn't at the part of their introduction that expected to cause the reaction. It wasn't their status as otherworlders that made him so surprised, in fact it seemed he could already tell somehow. No, it was their names that made him surprised, as if he knew them or had heard of them somehow. It had been quick, something most wouldn't have noticed them and do. But Shirzwa had gotten quite good at being on the lookout for such things since coming here. He had needed to in order to gauge who he could trust, the answer being depressingly few. Regardless, Shirzwa listened in as the men spoke of how he had come with his party to help eliminate the trolls. Of how he'd gone to the king to make a deal for his help, though admitting he would have come anyway. Shirzwa sensed no lies in his words, and it seemed Richard didn't either. When the men mentioned that he was doing this for only 500 gold, both Shirzwa and Richard were shocked. That little for something like this? It was insane. Shirzwa had heard during his guard duties nobles casually speak of spending twice as much on refurnishing their ballroom or setting up a feast. For the king to give so little, even if it was all Lucian had asked for, was insulting. The men didn't seem to care though, happy with what he'd asked for, and not asking for a copper more. After discussing strategy for a while, including Richard giving Lucian the latest information on the trolls' movements, a plan had been put into place. In 2 days Lucian would head to the last known position of the trolls with all the forces Richard could muster behind him. Together they would kill these monsters and save the people from their threat. Richard was rearing to go, and Shirzwa could say he and Bulat were of a similar mind. They were only waiting 2 days so that some more of the men could rest and heal, as well as prep there. When explaining their weapon situation, Lucian looked to his proclaimed brother. They had a conversation without words for a moment before the redhead spoke up. "I might have a way to help with that," the man said as he stepped forward. At all their questioning looks, the red-haired man held out his hand. A glow came forth for a moment, and when it faded a blade was now in his hand. That was surprising enough, but when 3 more swords came forth they were truly astounded. "I possess a skill known as multi-sword manifestation that allows me to make multiple swords using my own power. After much training I can make up to 50 at once, with each being equal to high-end normal-grade equipment. This, along with my own skills in gear upkeep, can aid you in your equipment problems," Blake said with a small grin on his face. Shirzwa thought that their luck was turning around. That, and that those trolls were about to be putting their regeneration to the test. Bulat was walking back to the barracks later that night after checking in on the men. Made a habit to do such since Richard took over, and let him do so, old military training coming to the forefront from when he'd check in on his own men. As he walked he thought back on the conversation earlier that day, of how that adventure came, and gave them something he knew was just as important to the men as food or weapons: hope. "I hope that they can put an end to this, that they could soon go home. That they wouldn't die on what had become a suicide deployment." It was as he was thinking this that he noticed a man coming towards him. From the silver hair, it was the man that had just been in his thoughts. In fact, Lucian Silver his name was. Bulat thought he was merely on a walk of some kind, until he motioned for him to stop. Was then that Bulat took in how they were secluded in this area of the fortification, alone with none to hear them speak. "So what is it?" he asked, trying not to be rude or let his suspicion leak into his voice. The man before him seemed to consider something before responding. "I have a question for you, Bulat," Lucian said, making the former night raid members. "And what would that be?" the former resistance fighter asked. Lucian took in a deep breath before looking him in the eyes. "Are you and Shirzwa under a lock spell?" the man asked with deadly calm. Bulat was surprised at first, but soon understood why he asked. Did they serve out of choice or circumstance, was what he truly wished to know. Bulat saw no point in lying regardless. "Yes," he said with a tired voice. At that answer Lucian seemed to think for a bit. When he had seemingly come to a conclusion, the man's next words made Bulat blink in shock. "What would you say if I could fix that?" he asked with a smirk. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 28, Interlude 2, Past and Reunion. Shirzwa was having an okay enough day for him. No one had chosen to piss him off yet, and Azaya hadn't shown his ugly mug around. It might even be a good day if that kept up. Was his day off from working with Tom, and he was just walking around for now. He thought he might stop by at Russia Sushi for a bite and say hello to Simon since things seemed to be going well. It was shortly after thinking this and starting to head towards the restaurant that it happened. The tall, false blonde-haired man dressed in a bartender outfit suddenly had a glowing sigil appear below him. In a flash of light he was no longer on the streets of Ikebukuro and instead found himself falling down a tunnel of lights. It was a kaleidoscopic haze of colors that surrounded him, and for a moment, he wondered if he had somehow died. Either that or Azaya had decided to somehow drug him in another of his attempts to make his life a living hell. It was as he fell through this tunnel of light that he thought back on his life. "I did my best, didn't I? I know I kept getting angry, kept getting fired. I know I must have stressed out Kasuka with all my job hopping, but I hope that finding something somewhat stable puts him more at ease. Even if I was nothing more than an enforcer for some debt collectors, he thought to himself as he reflected on how his life went. Request confirmed, unique skill enforcer has been granted, a strange voice said that Shirzwa barely noticed. He thought back on how when he was young his titular strength was too much for his body. How he would break himself just from using his strength. The pain of broken bones had become a well-known companion in his youth. That stopped in time though, now he rarely felt pain. Request confirmed, skill pain nullification has been granted, the voice chimed in response to those thoughts. Now I'm so tough that no normal punk can hurt me with their blows. Punches and bats or other weapons didn't really matter. They all barely do a thing to me. Typical for a monster like me, Shirzwa thought in self-hatred at his abnormal abilities. Request confirmed, skill physical attack resistance has been granted, the voice spoke once more in response to his thought. Oh well, at least I won't be causing any more issues for Kasuka or Tom and the rest. Will probably wonder where I went though, he thought at last, and closed his eyes, waiting until arrived in the next world. He just didn't expect it to be something other than the afterlife. No, instead when he next woke there were mages speaking in a strange language, and a man lying next to him. Somehow, he knew this didn't bode well for him. Bullet knew he was dying after fighting his old commander and the other two beasts, he was certain of that. They may now be dead, but he knew he wasn't far away from joining them. He was glad that he had protected Tatsumi though, even giving the young man in Curcio as a parting gift. That Taigu had served him well for quite some time, and he was glad it would now help protect his little bro. He would miss it though. Request confirmed, using remaining residue of the magical weapon in Curcio, and the user's desire to create the unique skill in Curcio, a strange voice said that he faintly. What Bullet didn't know was that shortly after closing his eyes in preparation for his final rest, he had suddenly begun to fall. He now was falling through a well of lights that his closed eyes didn't see, his body changing as he crossed the boundary between worlds. I guess this wasn't a bad death. I fulfilled my mission, protected my little bro, and even found a worthy successor for my Taigu. If only Liver's attacks hadn't made me so cold. Poison, he thought to himself, disliking how his final moments were spent in the cold rain and tainted water of his former commander. Request confirmed, the skills cold resistance and poison resistance have been granted, the same voice spoke once more to him. Bullet smirked as he fell, thinking back on his fight that resulted in his demise. I certainly gave as good as I got though. Each blow, be it from fist or water, I took and kept on swinging. But in the end, these injuries and poison were too much for even me to heal from, he thought, sad to have to leave Tatsumi and the others behind. Sad to not be able to see a freed empire where Honest and his ilk were gone. Request confirmed, the skills physical attack resistance, water attack resistance, and self-regeneration have been granted. The skills water attack resistance and cold resistance have been merged to create natural effects resistance. Natural effects resistance has been absorbed into the unique skill in Curcio, the voice said in response to his thoughts. I hope to see you all again in the next life, my friends. I'll go on and see the others and be waiting for you all. Win as I know you can night raid, Bullet thought right before falling unconscious from his wounds at last. When he next awoke though it wouldn't be to the sight of the pearly gates like he'd hoped, or the fires of hell like a part of him expected. No, instead it was to mages fussing over him, and soon enough being informed that he and a blonde man were now property of some kingdom known as Malstans. Maybe I am in hell after all, he said once it was just him and the blonde man, getting an incredulous snot from the other man. In a way this was like his own hell after all. He gave his life to fight against a nation that was cruel and exploitative of its people, only to be enchained to another that seemed all too much like the Empire. It was a twisted form of irony indeed. It had been a few days since she had arrived in the capital of the Holy Empire, and she was finally going to be meeting with her wayward student. Shizu had unfortunately arrived in the city while Hinata was out on a monster hunt, so she had been waiting for her to come back. She had just gotten word that she was back and wished to see her. So Shizu followed the messenger that had come to her in to inform her, and agreed to lead her to Hinata. Hinata lived in a relatively simple villa near the imperial palace that was somewhat removed from the hustle and bustle of the city. When the young woman who was leading her spoke on how Hinata had rejected the offer to live in a larger abode, Shizu just shook her head with a that was just like her student after all, liking her solitude and simple pleasures. The month they'd traveled together, she remembered how uncomfortable she was with some of the finery one of their noble clients had, though she imagined that Hinata had gotten more used to it after working in the empire for some time now. Entering the villa, she was directed to a dining room that currently had its white wooden doors. Stopping before the doors, the swordswoman took a deep breath before pushing open the doors. Once she stepped through the doorway, she took notice of the room she found herself in. It was a simple enough dining room, lacking extravagant decorations, but still adorned with warm white walls and a dark wood table that fit up to 6. The chairs around the table were made from the same wood as the table, and had black leather upholstery serving as cushions. A white tablecloth was draped onto the table, and white porcelain plates with gold trim were placed at each seat. The tableware and utensils were seemingly made from silver as well. None of that mattered to her though as much as the sight that greeted her at the head of the table, her student. Hinata both looked much like she had when she saw her last, and yet also looked so much more mature. She had always had an older tint to her eyes, something in her past having taken the light of youth well before it should have been, Shizu thought. Never told her much about her life back in Japan, but something told her it wasn't pleasant. Now though she looked far more like a woman than the teen she had taught, and a dangerous one at that. Yet she was still the same girl in other ways. Her tomboyish features remain ever present just like she had come to know her for. When Shizu first entered the room, Hinata had a harsh look to her, as if preparing to rip apart whoever came through those doors. She saw it was Shizu, her face changed to one of surprise. "It really is you," Hinata said before standing up from her spot at the head of the table. As she stood, Shizu got a good look at her student's attire. A black turtleneck and matching black slacks with a noticeable bulge on her hip. It seemed her student was still being prepared for anything, considering that it was likely a knife of some kind that made that bulge. Feet were plain black boots tied up tight as well. Compared to all the white and dark blue Shizu wore, it was like they were night and day in terms of color. Once Hinata came close to her, she lifted her hand up, as if wishing to test if this was real. She was real. Yet she stopped herself, seeming to shrink away for a moment. Shizu wasn't having any of this, however. She'd come to reconnect with her student, and she wasn't going to hide that now. So in a quick burst of speed, Shizu wrapped her arms around Hinata and hugged her close. "Of course it is silly," she said softly into Hinata's ear. It wasn't immediate, but soon enough Hinata returned the hug as well, Shizu ignoring the instinctive flinch of her hand towards the dagger at her side when she first initiated the hug. They merely stayed there for some time, embracing each other for a while in reunion. "It's good to see you again, teacher," Hinata said at last before pulling away from the hug. Shizu just smiled, water gathered in the corner of her eyes at finally seeing her wayward ward once again. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 29, Chapter 27. The next morning Bulat watched as Shirzwa and Alfred sparred, his thoughts on the conversation from last night. Lucian's words had made him come up short for a response, and when his stunned silence started to grow long, the man spoke once more. "Give it some thought, Bulat," was what the silver-haired man said to him before heading off. To be honest, the Hundredman Slayer hadn't gotten much sleep that night, contemplating whether or not the offer of freedom was real. In the end he decided to wait and see the character of this man more. The last thing he needed was to become free, at the expense of having a new master in control of his chains. No, he needed to be sure that this was genuine and possible. He wished to break free, not make an exchange. Focusing more on the fight, before him Bullet watched as the two men exchanged blows back and forth. Aford would throw a right jab, and Shurzwa would block with his forearm. Did a high kick, and Alfred responded with a flip backwards in order to dodge it. Stayed in this vein for some time, both holding back so as to not risk injuring each other or causing a scene. They had been going at this for over half an hour now though, neither looking winded in the least. Bullet sighed. He had full confidence that if Shurzwa were able to use his unique skill then he would have won by now. Though he didn't know if Alfred had a unique skill of his own, he doubted it since they were pretty rare for non-otherworlders. Shurzwa's unique skill Enforcer was a massively powerful skill, even on par with a Taigu from his old world. Enforcer let Shurzwa enhance his already formidable strength with its strengthened body subskill that turned his magicals into raw physical power that grew more efficient as time went, but that wasn't all. No, what made it such a fearsome skill was its other skills. The subskill Force Control allowed Shurzwa to have perfect control over how much force he hit with, allowing him to pace himself for more easily than most by conserving energy. It also allowed him to use a few special moves that he had been working on in secret, when he could with, but the last skill was what made him even scarier on the battlefield, Reinforcement. Reinforcement let Shurzwa reinforce both himself and anything he was in contact with to be able to withstand the force of his own attacks. This meant that any attack that didn't hit harder than him would be next to useless, making not only himself harder to arm, but even his weapons and armor next to impossible for most to break. What was even more impressive about his skill was the ability to apply the effect to another person as long as he made physical contact with them at the expense of not being able to apply it to anything else. Weren't for the energy cost of the ability, Shurzwa would be nigh unbeatable. Bullet felt. Stood the blonde man could only hold it for around 45 minutes before needing to rest. Still impressive though, and far beyond what most could do in this world or his old one. That skill Shurzwa could use no more than a wooden stick to dent armor made of steel. Had seen him do so in fact. Bullet's own unique skill was nothing to sneeze at either. His unique skill in Curcio, named after the Taigu he used for so long, was a massively powerful skill when used to its fullest. It granted him the ability to summon forth a set of armor similar to the original Incursio's armor, at will that didn't take nearly as much stamina. It made him faster, stronger, and capable of taking even more damage. The defensive abilities were only enhanced further by the sub-skill Natural Effects Resistance, that made most elemental magic highly ineffective against him. Furthermore, he had access to sub-skills like Presence Concealment, that worked better than the original Incursio's invisibility, as it completely hid his presence from those without sensory skills and even worked on some lower-tier sensory skills. Then there were the two sub-skills that enhanced his reaction time, Thought Acceleration and Instinctive Response. Thought Acceleration let him speed up his thoughts like the name suggested, while Instinctive Response granted him heightened senses that worked especially well at sensing danger, and then letting his body move to counter that threat with minimal input on his end. This had let him catch an arrow that would have struck the back of his head some months ago without even noticing it. Then there were the skills full-body armorize that summoned forth the armor of his skill, Armor Fusion, that made it so he could move in his armor, as if it were a second skin, and apply his other resistances to his armor and summon armament that let him summon forth a weapon made from the same material as his armor. But it was the final sub-skill, and its use that really made him far more powerful than before, Draconic Core. It stored something called Dragon Factor, that he got from killing dragons. Incurcio could use this factor to do two things: massively increase his raw power by burning away at the stored factor, or using the factor to adapt to new stimuli. The latter had only happened once so far, and that was to give him magic resistance after a Rouge Mage the Kingdom had sent him to kill was giving him the runaround. In all, this skill alone made him incredibly strong. That combined with how his body was somehow even stronger in this world, and his training showed even greater results. Bullet felt stronger than he ever had before. That didn't mean he wasn't prepared for some bigger fish to come along though. He knew better than to think there wasn't someone stronger than him out. The fact that it seemed at least one such man had shown up yesterday wasn't lost on Bullet. Watched as Alfred hit Shurzwa with a spinning roundhouse kick to the head, and sent the blonde flying. For a moment he was worried for his friend, that was until he heard the "I haven't been tossed around like that except for Bullet and Simon." Shirzwa shouted out with a chuckle. He wasn't normally one to laugh when fighting, but this wasn't a real fight now, was it? Was a friendly spar, something he never thought he could possibly do. Now though he could fight with someone without having to worry about his monstrous strength. Without having to worry about the collateral damage as much. The spars he'd had with Bullet and some of the other men had given him something he'd been searching for years to have: control. His skill let him control his power, yes, but the spars slowly let him learn to control his rage mid-fight. He still got angry, but it was more manageable than before. If there was one upside to this damn lock curse, it was that it stopped his rampages before they could truly begin. Part due to this, it became easier for him to not lose himself like before. With a sigh of satisfaction he stood back up from where the white-haired brawler had kicked him to, running a hand through his own blonde locks as he did so. It was strange though, his hair he meant. He wasn't a natural blonde, and had instead been born with brown hair. But despite not having dyed it once since arriving in this world, not even his roots grew in brown. No, it seemed that whatever process that had brought him here to this medieval fantasy world had made him a natural blonde as well. In a way he was glad. He'd been dyeing his hair for so long he barely remembered what he looked like with his natural color. Regardless, he stood back up and walked over to Alfred once more. Once within arm's length of the young man, he held out his hand to him. "That was a good spar. We should do this again sometime when we can both stop holding back," he said, a cocksure grin on his face that had made most street punks back home shiver. Alfred though just gave a matching grin and shook his hand in agreement. Shirzwa had been holding back in that fight, but he could tell that the man before him was also doing so. Were to guess, Shirzwa would say that a real fight between them would leave the ground cratered and unrecognizable to most afterward. Shirzwa could punch boulders into pebbles after all, and something told him that Alfred wasn't far from being able to do so himself, if not even greater feats of strength. After that they headed back to the stone fort, and made their way to the makeshift mess hall for some grub. Bullet followed them as they passed by. Lucian had asked him to watch over their match, something about not wanting a repeat of last time. For some reason that made the white-haired man walking beside him blush in embarrassment. It was none of his business though, so he didn't ask, despite Shirzwa being a bit curious about what last time Lucian was with Blake, watching as the redhead made sword after sword. Lucian wasn't staying idle, however. No, he had two very important tasks he was doing. One was making sure Blake paced himself and didn't go into exhaustion. The teen was still a stubborn one, and would overdo it if left to his own devices. The other task was using his young manipulation skill to make swords as well. The swords Lucian made were inferior in quality to the ones Blake made though. If he were to equate it to something, it would be that Blake's swords were on par with the quality of a properly smithied sword, while his own were limited to being the inferior skill-made ones. Like how two blades that were the same grade could have noticeable differences in quality. The Nephilim weren't sure if that was due to Blake's blacksmith training or his skill, or both. Either way, even with the lesser quality the blades Lucian was making would help supplement the lacking supplies the troops had. It truly was a sorry situation for this group of men. They were low on everything, from medical supplies to even basic food. The nearby villages did their best to help them, but they could only give so much, especially with how trade had all but stopped in the region due to the trolls. So, in addition to Lucian and Blake making more swords for them, he had told Surtur and Alice to help as well. Alice knew some basic, non-holy healing spells, and was using them as well as some of their stock of potions to help heal the men. Alice had made the spells after finding out how there wasn't really any healing magic that wasn't holy in nature. Since she couldn't use holy magic, at least not yet, the demoness decided to make her own healing spells. They were basic, equivalent to a basic heal spell, but they were a whole lot better than the nothing the troops had before. So that in combination with some potions had massively helped recover the troops' health. Surtur on the other hand had gone out to hunt in the local forested area. He brought back the likes of bull deer and rabbits, as well as a large boar monster. This gave the troops plenty of meat to aid their meager food stores. Lucian wasn't sure who the troops looked at with more gratitude, Alice for healing them or Surtur for bringing back a whole feast from the woods. The thought made him chuckle a bit, remembering the cheering the large boar had elicited from the men. It would be tomorrow morning that they did their final preparations, with the day after being when they'd march. Less than 48 hours until they went to kill the trolls. The thought of the trolls made Lucian remember what he'd been told the previous day by the commander. Richard had told him how they weren't dealing with regular trolls anymore. They were facing evolved trolls instead. The grand majority of the trolls were only slightly stronger than normal, and were still the standard troll race. But they had noticed at least 5 evolved trolls known as troll commanders. That would already be bad enough, but with so many in one group and them all following orders, that was far worse. Troll commanders were an evolution of trolls that occurred when a troll gained command over a small group of other trolls. They had increased intelligence, and were overall stronger than their normal counterparts by a factor of at least 10. But with so many showing up at once and following orders, Richard feared they were facing an even more evolved troll. Something known as a troll general, a species of troll that only came about when the unique monster known as a troll chieftain gained multiple evolved subordinates. A troll general was bad news in the extreme, being far more intelligent to the point of approaching a human-level intellect. They employed strategies, troop formations, and even had the ability to gain total command over all their troops regardless of distance. Monster hadn't been seen in centuries. The only reason Richard even knew about it was due to the scary tales told in the villages that recounted it. The events of the last troll general having been turned to legend over time. If they were facing such a monster, and Lucian had little reason to doubt that, then it wouldn't surprise him if they were going to encounter a demon lord seed. From what he'd been told, it seemed highly likely that this troll general was akin to an orc lord like what Geld Sr. had been, but far more bloodthirsty. Trolls cared for little besides eating, meat of all kinds being their preferred diet. There was a reason that finding bodies in the aftermath was rare when investigating a troll attack. From what the legends spoke of, a troll general's enhanced intelligence didn't change that goal. That meant they were soon to confront a beast that could not be negotiated with, reasoned with, or otherwise attempt to persuade against fighting. No, this beast and its followers will fight to the death no matter what, and have no concept of mercy in them. They were a foe that would not stop until they were all dead. It was a good thing then that Lucian was not worried about making trolls an endangered race if it came to it then. If things came to the worst, he was fully prepared to unleash some of his more destructive abilities, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. Later that night the man and Lucian's group celebrated around a large fire, the boar Surtur caught roasting over it on a spigot. Soldiers smiled and laughed as they hugged comrades. They had thought on death's door not but a few hours earlier, happy to be alive. Was with Shirzwa and Bulat, drinking and speaking of days to come. Lucian himself was with his party by the flames, Surtur and himself turning the large boar to ensure it cooked evenly. Blake was talking with Alfred on the spar the demon had with Shirzwa earlier that day, with Alice shaking her head at her brother's antics. It was a nice scene, especially since Lucian had asked Alice for a favor earlier. The favor had been to curse the mage in charge of Shirzwa and Bulat's lock spells. She did so with a smile, and now the mage was suffering from a bad case of stomach cramps and nausea. The old man was certain he'd gotten food poisoning from something the soldiers made, and was stuck in bed now, leaving the two summons to enjoy some time away from the annoying man. That mage was an annoying one, seeming to legitimately think himself superior to both the two otherworlders and the soldiers in the group. He was apparently the second son of a noble family and thought himself important because of his position as one of the county's only. That was despite the fact that even at the age of 62 he was barely a mid-class mage in skill. Lucian is fairly sure he saw AB rank 20-something at one of the guilds that could outclass the Mun. It was annoying to say the least. All that combined with the story he'd heard from Shirzwa a bit ago on how he'd left the original command to die in order to save his own hide and to protect the kingdom's assets made the silver-haired man dislike him immensely. In essence, his death wouldn't be a weight on his mind in the least. That was part of his plan after all, to have the mage die in the ensuing fight, and taking that moment to fake Shurzwa and Bulat's deaths. With a simple use of essence of flame to burn away the lock curse, the two would be free in no time. He just needed to make sure that the mage wasn't around to tell the king anytime soon. Lucian wasn't worried about Richard or the others telling others about it either. None of them liked the mage, and Richard considered the two men friends. "This is going to be one interesting battle indeed," he said aloud before moving to join his brother and Spawn in conversation. Edited, January 28, 2026. Chapter 30, Chapter 28. It was the morning now of the day they were to set off. Many were worried among the common soldiers, not favoring their odds against the far more individually powerful trolls. Not that Lucian didn't blame them. In total, barring him and his group, their force numbered somewhere near 325 men after healing as many as they could. They left roughly 60 men back at the fort, only a third of that number being well enough to walk on their own, with the rest remaining injured. Of the rest of the original 500 men, they were either dead or had deserted upon finding this to be a losing battle. Richard led the troops further into the eastern front towards the small, nameless village that was the most likely next target for the trolls. The goal was to reach the open plains some distance around the village and intercept the troll horde before they made the village a slaughterhouse. This would involve them reaching the area north of the village as the trolls were moving southward to come down towards the village. From what they were able to tell, the force of monsters numbered a little over 200. Force that, while not monstrous in size, due to the kingdom's mismanaging of the situation, Lucian knew posed a sizable threat. The death count after all was estimated to have recently surpassed the 4-digit mark already. In only roughly half a year, this monster and its army had killed enough to meet 1/10 of the required souls for a harvest festival. That was all. With them only attacking smaller villages and towns as well as the unfortunate trade caravan. Lucian shuddered as they marched, thinking what would happen should they attack a more populous settlement like a city. It was likely that if they attacked some major settlements, then this troll general could possibly reach the status of a demon lord. The only hope they had was that this monster had yet to gain a name, but that was a flimsy hope. While he knew not of any monster to have gone through the harvest festival without possessing a name, it did not mean it wasn't possible. Yet to happen did not mean impossible after all. Deciding that this train of thought wouldn't serve him well, Lucian chose to think on something else as he walked alongside his party. The two other worlders among the army's number, to be specific. He had confirmed that they both were under a lock spell, and wished to be free of their enslavement by the kingdom of Malstance, something he would see done in the coming conflict. No, that wasn't what drew his thoughts though. It was something far more important. He knew them. Not in the way one knows a friend, or even how one knows a celebrity or historical figure. No, he knew them because he saw their stories on a screen play out before him. Saw how one was meant to die on a boat fighting for what he believed in while gifting the weapon that would see his revolution's success to the one who would help it come about. The other he saw in a cityscape where the absurd and supernatural met the gangs and criminal underworld of modern Japan, where he was known as the strongest. It was not something he had prepared himself for, to say the least. To see characters from what he watched in his past life be real in this world that never had them originally. Knew he was in a world that had been but fiction in his first life, but to see those from whole other stories show up was beyond what he could have imagined. The implications alone made his thoughts race now that he had a moment to think to himself. Does this mean there could be others? Was one such thought that kept plaguing him. To be honest, it wasn't the men themselves that now set him on edge, but what they could represent. While neither man came from a universe whose laws outright contradicted the laws he knew this multiverse had, if he encountered others that may not hold true. Lucian knew that Veldanava made not just the cardinal world that he was currently living in, but an entire multiverse. But there existed other stories with other creators. Other multiverses. It reminded him of a theory he had heard once before. Of how there are infinite universes inside the container, that is the multiverse, there could be infinite multiverses inside an even larger container. An omniverse, if you will. He had no proof that such a thing existed, or that this was the case, but the thought of others from other works of fiction showing up made him consider it. For now, though he had every reason to believe that Bulat and Shurzwa came from within this multiverse made by the Star King Dragon. But the idea that they did not, and that others could be here as well. That was all the more reason to push him to get him, and his stronger and prepare. For he shuddered at what horrors could be lurking out there in the infinite expanse of realities. Blake looked on as the soldiers set up the encampment some 2 miles from the village. These men had been trained in how to make basic fortifications out of the terrain during their, in his eyes, mediocre military training. It made a certain degree of sense from what he knew of this nation's training regimen. Most of the soldiers were given basic drill instruction more focused on following orders than real combat ability, with the rest of their time in training being regulated to how to transform the battlefield before even a drop of blood was spilled. The true martial training was only given to officers, knights, and others of sufficient status or showing exceptional ability. This resulted in the vast majority of troops they had being little better than laborers with passing skill in how to wield swords, spears, and shields. If Blake were being brutally honest, most of these men looked like they'd be more comfortable with a hammer or shovel than a. That wasn't meant as anything against them, it was merely what their training had resulted in. Some had gained better combat ability since being deployed, but it was still not nearly up to the standard he would have wished for in an army. It did mean, though, that they were making great progress on building what he and Richard had thought up to prepare for the battle. Surtur was a massive help as well in getting the materials from the woods. In short, they had built a massive, curved wall made of wood that would serve as a defensive measure for wounded troops and the suppliers. In front of the wall was a dugout pit with a single walkway that funneled troops through so as to limit the trolls' avenue of approach. This was all to serve as a place for injured troops to retreat to and get healed up by the waiting medical team. Though it was small in number, it would serve them. This would let them be able to keep more men fielded for longer, thus allowing more men to keep the rank and file of the enemy busy while the heavy hitters took on the leaders. Basic strategy they had produced was to attack the leaders, the troll commanders, and draw out the troll general. Once the big boss was spotted, a team of their strongest fighters would take it on. The idea was that once the leader was killed, the rest of the trolls would become far less capable and fall far easier. It was a good plan, especially considering the only reason all these trolls were working together in the first place were the skills those leaders had. The team that would tackle fighting the big guy consisted of himself, Lucian, Shurzwa, and while they fought the troll general, Alice, Alfred and Surtur would take on the rest of the high-ranking trolls, and Richard would stay back by the fortifications and take command of the troops to keep order and react to any changes in real time. That pesky mage the kingdom sent would also sit by with Richard, supposedly to give the commander sound. Everyone knew he just didn't want to risk his own hide, though. But that was the plan in its most basic form. While the men worked on building and digging, Surtur enlarged back to his true size, and took whole trees from the forest, and Alice making potions with what she had on hand. Blake wasn't sitting idle. He was making more and more swords for the men for the coming battle. It was due to this mass making of swords that he'd actually found out some things about his skill. It turned out that he could make swords that didn't require him to expend magicules to keep existing, if he pushed more magicules into the. At first, this was highly inefficient, and was nearly 5 times the base magicule cost. When Lucian found out about this, he seemed to take on a dazed look for a moment, like he was talking to someone only he could hear. After a moment, though, he promptly face-bombed, and made a new deal with Blake. This deal was to give the redhead the material creation skill in exchange for Blake giving him a high five. Once that was done, the cost to make his swords permanent fell to only cost twice as much magicules to create than a normal sword. That was due to the material creation skill synergizing with his multi-sword manifestation. Now he was wasting far less magicules when making more permanent swords. This did result in his production falling to roughly 25 swords a day. Then there was the litany of other swords he'd made before figuring this out, that he had been maintaining since he made them with his power. That required far less magicules to keep up, since the majority of the cost for his skill was the initial manifestation of the swords. It costs less than a 20th of the energy to summon them to keep them around. To put it into perspective, that was still annoying to keep up, especially as it cut into the number of now permanent blades he could make. That was where Alfred came in though. The white-haired demon had come up with the idea of using his young manipulation skill to try and strengthen the swords. He already made to make them no longer need him to keep supplying magicules in order to. This idea turned out to work, and now Alfred was going through the roughly 200-something swords that he needed to make fully permanent now. Alfred had been a bit bummed to have to do something that wasn't fighting, especially since finding such a good sparring partner in Shirzwa, but he sat down and got to work knowing how important it was. It made Blake smile seeing his nephew have such a good friend. It was as he had these thoughts that a large shadow fell across his sitting form, where he was making another blade. The shadow belonged to the large form of Surtur carrying 2 fully grown trees, one over each shoulder. It had been a simple enough matter to explain away the half-ogre's size as being due to a size enlargement skill. That saved them from having to explain that the large man wasn't human, and that his real skill was what made him look like just a particularly tall. The men bought it though, the illusion still in place hiding his horns made it easy enough to do so. Now he was making the trek back and forth from the woods some 3 miles away to bring back lumber for the men to make the wall. It worked really well, and the giant wasn't getting tired from doing so really. The walk was also far shorter for him due to his size, that combined with the great stamina his giant ancestry gave him made it the perfect job for him. Surtur gave him a friendly nod as he passed and went to take the lumber to the drop-off area that had been outlined for him. Gave a wave back at his companion before getting back to work. It was as he was finishing the next blade that he thought about how his older brother was. He had a particularly important job after all. The redhead just hoped he didn't run into any trouble though while doing it. "Lucian, you better not get into another mess," he said with a sigh when thinking about his brother's habit of getting into crazy situations, though the teen wasn't much better. Alfred and Alice, who had been sitting nearby, just laughed at his words as if to say, "You." Sadly though, Blake did in fact know his brother all too well and sighed once the fact he had a small smile on his face as he didn't mean anything though, and he'd fight any who said otherwise. Lucian was a fair distance away from the encampment the men were setting up. The forested area several miles away from them right now, having left for his task after discussing things with Richard. He now had a very important task that he just so happened to have the perfect skill for. Finding where exactly the troll horde was, and how long they had to. This was perfect for him due to the skill he gained from his desperation to find his brother all those months ago back in Dworgen, tracking. That skill combined with his universal perception skill made it far easier for him to hunt down the location of the horde than any scouting party the men could form. Thus leading him to his current task. Once he was sufficiently far from the army he'd unleashed his wings, and took flight over the trees to gain a better view for his skill. Now he was flying over the treetops, spotting the occasional animal or beast-type monster as he went. That was until he got further into the wooded area. All of a sudden the wildlife thinned out. Till it was non-existent, only the plants remaining. That told him he was close to his target. Flying onward it was but a few more miles till he spotted them, a large horde of tall, earthy-colored humanoids marching towards where he knew the village lay. They numbered 220 strong, not including the 5 commanders and the general. Surprised him though was what the trolls were holding. Crude and wooden mostly, some with just a large stone, but weapons all the same. Lucian knew the more evolved trolls had some form of intelligence, but for them to arm their men was something else entirely. Richard had never said anything about them wielding any form of weapon either, in fact mentioning the lack of their use before. That means this was a recent change, and that could spell trouble. That also meant that something far more dangerous was occurring. They were learning. It was with this thought in mind that the Nephilim chose to search for the troll general. Using his skills and enhanced senses he soon found him, and he was slightly taken aback by the sight. The monster was huge, standing close to 20 feet in height, and thus double the standard height of his men. Upon his body were strange red markings reminiscent of war marking Lucian had seen in history books depicting war chiefs. He couldn't tell if those marks were drawn in blood, or now a part of the beast's skin either. In the monster's right hand was a large sword that looked like a claymore in design. Made it all the worse was what Lucian could sense from the blade, specifically what it was made from. A magisteel sword had somehow found its way into the monster's hands, likely from some adventurer that thought they could make a name for themselves by killing it. The sword was in the beast's hands, its property of changing into a form best suited for its wielder giving the troll general a fearsome weapon. Suddenly the threat this thing posed was far greater than he had expected. Lucian was tempted to just send a magic attack at the horde and end this, but he knew that wouldn't work. For one, he'd cause far too much collateral damage, and make the forest uninhabitable, for this would result in more monster attacks, less food, and more problems for the surrounding area. Then there was the fact that it might not even work depending on the attack. All of those trolls had massively powerful regeneration, apparently capable of regenerating from almost anything as long as enough of their head was intact. And that was just normal trolls. He didn't know how strong the evolved forms were in terms of regeneration. Then there was the risk of what killing the majority of the horde might do to the general, should he. What Clayman did in canon in his last moments showed that outright evolution wasn't the only avenue of increasing one's power after all. Should the troll general do something similar, Lucian feared what could come from that. The possibility of the monster known as a troll general going through something akin to such a thing in the event of its troops' utter and sudden decimation is over 40. This is due to the extreme fear and terror that its victims' souls have imprinted upon it in death. Puriel informed him without any prompting. Only slightly better than a coin flip, not something I want to hedge my bets on, Lucian said to himself before flying away. He was heading back to the encampment now. He had much to report. This battle was going to be more intense than he had thought, but he knew they were going to be ready. Wouldn't let some no-name monster put his family at risk after all. Edited, January 28, 2026. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.